In this video, we will be exploring the entire 6th tier of the largest unsolved mystery iceberg ever made. The full iceberg has over 1,000 entries, and in this video, we will explore mysteries that range from one of the most interesting, fascinating, and mysterious cases I've ever covered, of these very odd structures with deadly properties that were once seen protruding out of the ground all over Siberia, but now, over time, have completely sunk down, making locating them, let alone studying them, almost impossible. To the very strange case of a man in Dublin killed behind a locked door, and the attempt to prosecute a seemingly innocent man based almost solely on the shape of his head, to the absolute wild rabbit hole of a case that starts off as a UFO sighting and ends in secret military weapons and government cover-ups. These are just a few of the cases covered, and the rest range from missing persons to serial killers to unsolved murders to hoaxes, cryptids, paradoxes, and much more. This video is a supercut of every video I've made in the 6th tier, and so it contains a ton of cases. I've removed all of the intros and outros, cleaned them all up a little bit, and so with that being said, please enjoy this supercut of the 6th tier of the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. So grab a drink, my choice today is fennel tea, and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. San Francisco John Doe number 60. So this was the body of a young man found in 1985, San Francisco. Now this wasn't exactly your normal John Doe, your normal body that was found. I mean, not that there's really a normal for finding a dead body, but this one showed signs that whoever it was, he had been horrifically tortured and mutilated before his death. He was found wrapped inside of a blanket and shoved underneath a semi-truck on the street of a local downtown market. From what they could tell from the body, he was a white guy, he was around 5'5" and weighed around 130 pounds, or around 60 kilos give or take. His hands were actually tied and bound behind his back with guitar string, and as I said, the marks on his body were really just horrific. He had several cuts and burns all over his body. He had apparently hot wax poured into his eyes, and his precious parts had been horribly mutilated. So yeah, just a horrific way to go and a horrific crime. And on top of all that, on his chest, the young man had an upside down pentagram carved into it. So immediately the first thought of the law enforcement was that maybe this was something to do with a cult ritual or a sacrifice or something like that. So they did their best to try and maybe contact local occult members, or to try and maybe find different suspects who were into that sort of thing. But they weren't able to identify the man himself, hence being a John Doe, and so it was a little hard to try and track and investigate who he knew, where he was from, what links to occult rituals that he might have had. And so they did their investigations, but nothing really got anywhere, and the case basically lay cold for about 2 years. And that is when things start to get a little bit complicated. So after about 2 years, police start looking into this guy called Maurice Bourque, who had at the time been accused of robbery and kidnapping, and one of his apparent victims had a pentagram carved into his chest, and this victim identified Maurice as the person who did it to him. And so the authorities thought that these cases were somewhat similar, and so they had Maurice as a potential suspect for the John Doe killing. But that's at this point about as far as they went with it, as there really wasn't too much evidence for the John Doe killing, so by extension there wasn't actually too much linking Maurice and this original murder, at least nothing that would hold up in court. But he was wanted for a few crimes up in Canada and for his, as I mentioned earlier, robbing and kidnapping case, and so he was arrested, he was sent to jail, and after being in jail for around about a year, he willingly, actively contacted the police on his own and said that he wanted to resolve an unsolved murder. And when they asked what case and who this was, he said that it was the murder of John Doe number 60. So he was brought in and questioned about this, and he actually blamed his ex-boyfriend, Maurice's ex-boyfriend, and said that it was his ex who tortured and killed this John Doe, and Maurice had helped him hide and cover up the body. So this is like very wild already. Like, it does seem a bit strange that Maurice would willingly contact the police and basically admit to something as heinous as this. Like, I know he said that he didn't do the killing or he didn't do the torturing, but still, being an accessory to something like this and hiding the body is still fairly bad, and it'd probably net you a decent few years in prison. But maybe he was just trying to get ahead of it in case they ever got proper evidence, and in case he was ever caught for it, maybe he wanted to make a plea deal or something like that. Maurice's ex was a man named Clifford Joseph, and he worked as a waiter in San Francisco, as well as generally trying to help the needy. He often opened his doors to people who were homeless or struggling or young or some combination of those three, you know, giving them a place to stay so they don't have to sleep on the street sort of thing. And while this looks and sounds very noble and very kind, Maurice told police that this was basically just a front, and he was actually a super bad guy who would lure in homeless people, vulnerable people, and, you know, do some pretty messed up stuff to them. So at this point, it's like, who do you believe? It's kind of like two different statements against each other sort of thing. You know, both could logically be true, and there wasn't really much evidence connecting anyone to the murder or the torture. So police at this time kind of had their hands tied. Clifford was eventually taken in, he was interviewed, and he was charged with not just this crime, but a few other crimes that had taken place since this initial killing. There were a few witnesses brought in who were some of the times current tenants of Clifford, some of the time ex-tenants or ex-boyfriends or people who knew Clifford, just kind of character witness sort of things. And honestly, some of these witnesses seemed like very unhinged, strange individuals themselves, with one guy claiming to have been involved in a secret assassination of someone high up in the government, and he also claimed to have had sexual relationships with both Elton John and Liberace, which, like, yeah, of course he did. But these were the types of witnesses that they were dealing with. Basically, the evidence was very thin and circumstantial. The accusation by Maurice might have just been out of malice or spite or just to get revenge for something. The witnesses and character witnesses were either a little nutty themselves or was very thin on the surface, and the whole case just seemed a little flimsy and thin. But it still went through, and Clifford was charged and found guilty of this murder and was sentenced to 34 years to life in the Folsom State Prison. And Clifford has never admitted to any of this. He maintained his innocence from the start, all throughout the trial, and ever since. Which, I mean, I know a lot of criminals do maintain their innocence, so it's not exactly a huge deal, but it is just something to note. Some people do genuinely believe that Clifford is innocent. As I said, the witness testimony was a little flimsy and weak, and the actual physical evidence tying him to the crime was very flimsy and shaky and thin. For instance, one of the only pieces of physical evidence they found were these bloodstains in Clifford's home that matched the same blood type as John Doe number 60. And that was kind of all. But obviously, if Clifford is letting people into his home and opening up his home, then the blood could really have gotten there in any number of ways, especially considering Maurice was staying there. And so if he had just killed this guy in the house or nearby, you know, if they were doing all this without Clifford's knowledge sort of thing, then it could very well have gotten past him. Or it could be that he was home all the time and so obviously knew about this bloodstain, and so the jury thought that he was, if not the perpetrator, at least an accessory to whatever happened. So it's a strange one. John Doe number 60 has never actually been identified, which is incredibly sad, and this horrific case basically ends without a conclusion. I think the people who likely did this are at least now behind bars, so maybe it does have somewhat of a just ending, but still we never did find out who the John Doe was. The 1966 triple murder of Hendersonville. So this was a wild, brutal case. It took place obviously in 1966 in North Carolina, and it shook the entire local town for weeks and months to come. So our story starts with two men, Charles Hill and Larry Shipman, who were disposing of some tree branches and some tree limbs that they cut down. You know, they threw them in their truck and were disposing of them in this little grassy patch off a side road, which was apparently a common area that people went to, you know, dump stuff in. So they went here to dump the branches, and they saw what looked like mannequins. So very creepy at first. They went up to the mannequins, looked a little closer, and then they realized that they weren't mannequins. These were the dumped bodies of Louise Davis Shoemate, Charles Glass, and Vernon Shipman. They were all beaten to death, all suffered head wounds, and all had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. Now, Vernon and Charles were actually connected, not by blood, but by occupation and by relationship. The two men were romantic partners and were also business partners, owning and running a local music store. But Louise Liz was a factory worker that seemed to have no connection to the men or to the case, and things did get a little stranger when they did more investigating. But for now, people were wondering, like, what the heck was going on here? Why were these 3 people killed, and by who? And was this part of a random impulsive killing, or was this some sort of serial killer that might strike again? Nobody really at the time knew. These were, by all accounts, very good, liked people that were killed. They were all very close to the community. The music store that the 2 men were running was very popular, especially with the youth, and they were the type of people that basically had no enemies, so them being killed in this manner was extremely shocking. So after this, the entire community just basically went on edge. Everyone was suspicious, like 24/7. They were locking their doors. They would pick their kids up straight from school. They wouldn't allow their kids to go outside and play. It was really just a horrible time. And the lack of general evidence for this led to there being quite a few of different theories for what actually happened and why and who actually committed these murders. One theory was that Vernon and Charles were killed because they were gay. So apparently it was like a hate crime sort of thing, which, I mean, is a possible theory, I guess, but the 2 men weren't really hated or despised within the town. You know, most people seemed to really like the music store, they thought that they were great guys, and nobody really had a problem with them. Another theory was that because Charles was into the occult sort of things, where he was into, you know, voodoo stuff and hexes and spells and potions, that maybe he had tried to hex, or he scammed the wrong person maybe, and then that person got revenge on him and his partner, which again is probably always a possibility, or that this was just a crime of passion in the moment, or that it was a serial killer. So there was a few different theories on the 2 men, but as I said, the woman wasn't really connected to the 2 men at all, so it is thought that she probably wasn't the main target of the killings, and that perhaps she had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, stumbled across the event, stumbled across the bodies, and she was sadly taken out alongside them. And as for suspects, as for motives, as for evidence, it was a series of kind of unfortunate events. To begin with, there wasn't actually too much physical evidence anyway, and over the years, due to poor handling or to confusion, a lot of the already sparse evidence ended up going missing or being lost or being corrupted, and so eventually, over X amount of time, there was actually very little evidence to show for the case. But a few of the investigators that were close to the case have said, and they believed even up until their dying day, that a man named Edward Thompson Jr. was responsible for these killings. He was a man who had been on a quite recent spree of murder, kidnapping, and assault, and the Times News posted an article during this spree that said that any citizen that sees him may arrest him on sight, or to kill him if he resists without being subject to legal action, which is just an insane thing to post in a newspaper, by the way, but Times News did it. So Thompson sent a letter to the Times News saying that, like, yeah, you think writing about me is fun? Alright, I'll give you something to write about. And then this triple murder happened. A bunch of the details in this case and in similar crimes that Thompson committed were quite similar in nature, and Thompson had apparently admitted to a bunch of people at the time, both in and out of jail, that he had actually committed these murders. Now again, whether he was telling the truth on these or whether it was just a bragging thing, you know, taking credit for it to up his body count sort of thing, which does happen, but either way, he was a major suspect for these. And on top of all that, he was actually in and around Hendersonville at the time that the murders were committed. So that's the main suspect that a lot of people do believe committed these. But there were a few other suspects, one for example being Jim Burrows, who actually also confessed to the murders. But most people believe that it was Thompson who genuinely committed them, but he was never charged for them, and a short while later, Thompson died in prison. So with a lot of people believing that Thompson committed them, and with Thompson already being dead, it seemed like there was kind of no one to charge, and so no one ever was charged for these 3 murders. And this is where, today, this case still lies. I think it's unlikely to ever be solved or concluded, as it seems like Thompson probably committed the murders, but you obviously can't charge a dead man. So a bit of a strange case, a very sad and tragic case, and rest in peace to these three lovely souls. 1966 World Cup Finals Ghost Goal. So this is an interesting one. Picture the scene. It's 1966 World Cup Final, England versus Germany. After 90 minutes full time, the score is 2-2. So they go into extra time, and then this happens. Jeff Hurst gets the ball with a wonderful cross and then knocks it straight into the German goal, scoring his second goal of the match. Or so it seems. This goal was seemingly so close to the actual goal line that it was massively disputed at the time. The Germans were obviously saying it didn't count as a goal, it didn't go over the line, it bounced off the top bar, and the English were celebrating like mad because they believed that it was a goal, and the goal did end up going to England, making the score 3-2 at the time, and then they later went on to score another goal, making it 4-2 by the end of the match. Jeff Hurst scored a hat-trick in that game and won England their first ever World Cup. But back then, and even since then, there have obviously been tons of debates and arguments and back and forth about whether that goal actually counted, and how if they didn't score that goal, maybe they wouldn't have scored the second one, and Germany might have actually won the World Cup that year. So yeah, very interesting one, bit of a fun one, so let me know where you stand on this. The AEW World Championship theft. This one is a little unusual and a little bit funny in a way. Chris Jericho, who was a professional wrestler, was crowned the All Elite Wrestling Champion. He was awarded and given the champion's belt and was traveling home at the time for his well-deserved rest and break. The flight that he was on had to land a little sooner and a little shorter due to bad weather, so Chris decided to hire a limo driver and to drive him and his group the rest of the way home. So he called up the limo driver arrived, and he basically put all of his stuff inside the limo. Belongings, clothes, suitcases, and the AEW championship belt that he had been awarded. On the way home, they decided to stop off at a steakhouse because, I mean, all good wrestlers need steak. But this is where things started to go a little bit wonky. Chris had actually taken the wrong luggage from the airport. So they made some arrangement while Chris and his group went into the steakhouse to, have some drinks, have a meal. The limo driver would drive back to the airport and swap out the luggage Chris had taken with his actual luggage. And the limo driver then came back to the steakhouse, went in, had a little chat with Chris, went back out, and then he came in a second time later on and told Chris that the championship belt had been stolen. Like, just straight out of the limo, apparently. First, Chris accused the limo driver himself of actually stealing the belt. And he was like, I didn't steal anything, I'm just a limo driver. But then he asked the limo driver if, when he had come into the steakhouse the first time, if he had left the limo open or if he had locked it. And the driver said that he didn't remember locking it and he probably just left it open when he went into the steakhouse. Which, it's like, why wouldn't you lock your limo if you're leaving it? It kind of doesn't make sense, especially if you're a professional limo driver. So they called the police, they did some interviews, they filed a report for the missing belt, and it was only actually days later when the belt turned up, because someone reported it in, as they said they saw it in the middle of the road as they were just, driving down. And so they stopped, picked up the belt, and then called up the police and handed it in. But before turning it into the police, the guy who found it posted it on the local lost and found page on Craigslist. Like, how do you even think to put a championship belt onto the lost and found on Craigslist? Like, it's actually comical. But another twist in this is that the road that the guy apparently found the belt on wasn't a road that the limo had actually driven down. Like, it wasn't on their route from the airport to the steakhouse, so they honestly had no clue how the belt even got there if the guy was telling the truth and that's where he found it. So did he actually somehow find the belt in the middle of the road? Did he take it from the limo? And if he did take it from the limo, was the limo driver in on it? Like, he left the doors open, called a friend to come take the belt, and then they just kind of bailed on the idea when they knew it was getting too serious. And so they made up this story about finding it in the road, and then turned it in. We really don't know. The belt ended up getting returned, everything kind of went back to normal, and so a somewhat light-hearted one, but still a mystery nonetheless. Akita City Empty House Calls. So this is apparently a somewhat common occurrence in Japan, as well as to an extent worldwide, where these ghost calls essentially are made to a fire brigade, and when the fire brigade eventually tracks down the call and finds the house that the call was made from, they show up there, and normally there's nobody home. The doors are all locked, the lights are all turned off, and when they go inside the house to investigate, the phone is, on the latch, it's put down, it's not hanging or anything. So all in all, this is very strange. The person on the other end of the phone, the emergency services operator, they tend to hear just like buzzing and or crackling, and the typical protocol is to, when you get no response, to hang up and then to try and call the number back, and then if it doesn't pick up, then they send out the fire brigade. So these types of occurrences normally happen a few times a year, like maybe once or twice on average, and they are often just blamed on like faulty phone lines. But in 2014, in the city of Akita, these ghost calls spiked from, as I said, like once or twice per year up to 9 times in just a few months. And nobody has figured out who or what actually made these phone calls. Were they made by ghosts around the city for various reasons? Were they simply, faults in the phone lines? Or were they caused by a human error? A phone operator maybe making a mistake in the lines? Or by doing it on purpose and making these faulty calls themselves? We don't really know, at least for now. So this kind of strange, kind of spooky case is, at least until we call the Ghostbusters in, a mystery. Alex Slowly was a 16-year-old boy who disappeared in London, actually not too far from where I am, which is a little troubling, but this was in 2008, and Slowly at the time was staying in a friend's house in northern London, and on the 2nd of August he left his friend's house to return home for his 17th birthday, and he was just never seen again. He wasn't caught on any CCTV footage. He had very little, if not no, money on him. He didn't take his passport, he didn't take a change of clothes, and his phone stopped sending out signals soon after he disappeared. It was a very, very strange case, but there sadly, honestly, wasn't too much to go off. He was a student in London, and his disappearance initially was put onto him just running away, or being killed by a gang that he owed money to or something, or just a whole range of theories. And I think Alex running away is one of the most unlikely theories, as if you are genuinely running away, you would just take everything with you. I mean, maybe you leave your phone so like you can't be tracked, but why wouldn't you take your passport, your cash, at least a change of clothes? Like, there's no reason not to take that. So I think that's a completely absurd theory. He could have been the victim of a serial killer of some kind, or of a gang attack. And not that he was necessarily in a gang, but there were some rumors that he maybe owed some money to 1 or 2 people who were in a gang, and maybe he just kind of caught the wrong end of the stick. The fact that there was no CCTV footage whatsoever makes this a very strange case, as there are CCTV cameras on every tube station, train station, etc., even buses in London. So it seems like he just walked out the front door of his friend's house and then just disappeared into thin air. And as of today, 16 years later, this case is still unsolved and still remains a mystery. Andrew Gosden was, strangely, even though this tier of the iceberg is ordered alphabetically, he was actually thought to be connected to our previous entry, Alex Slowly. So Andrew Paul Gosden was 14 years old at the time, and he was living in Doncaster, South Yorkshire. On September 14th, 2007, Andrew withdrew £200 cash from his bank account, and he bought a one-way ticket from Doncaster to King's Cross Station. That day, he packed a bunch of his clothes, his wallet, his keys, and his PSP. But strangely enough, he actually left his PSP charger at home. And he also left at home £100 cash that he had from like savings from birthdays and stuff, which is very odd. It's like, if you're taking £200 out from the bank account, why not instead just take £100 out and use the £100 cash that you have? Or why not take all the money you have. So yeah, that part's a little strange. He left his house and got to the local train station at around 9 a.m. that day. And again, very strangely, his ticket from Doncaster down to London cost £31.40. And the return ticket, so to go from Doncaster down to London and then back up home to Doncaster, cost only 50 pence more, which the woman at the counter selling him the ticket made him aware of, and he basically didn't care. He said, no, just give me the single ticket. So it doesn't seem like he was looking to come back to Doncaster, at least not anytime soon. But if he wasn't looking to come back, which is kind of enforced by the idea that he took a bunch of his clothes with him, as you wouldn't really take, you know, a bunch of clothes if you were just going out for the day. But if he were planning to go away for a long time, if not permanently, why not take the PSP charger or the extra cash that he had in his room? It's like there's some very conflicting ideas here. Nobody knows why he went, who he was meeting, if anyone, or where he ended up. He was seen on CCTV camera arriving at King's Cross and leaving through the main exit, but after that, he was never seen again. Now, the entire day of his disappearance was like super chaotic, and there was tons of mistakes made by various people, but they didn't know it at the time. As I said, Andrew left his house in the morning, and instead of going to school, he went to the local train station. And while he was on the train down to London, he was obviously supposed to be in school, so the school ended up calling his parents and saying that he was absent from school and, you know, asking where he was, if he was sick, etc. But his parents didn't pick up, so they just left them a message, and that was it. But the school hadn't apparently even called his parents. They were apparently going down the list of names and then, you know, following it along over to get the parents' phone number, and I guess they tracked wrongly with their finger, and so they called the number of the parents below the number they should have called, and these parents weren't in or they didn't pick up, and so the school left a message to the wrong parents. So come evening time, when Andrew's family all came home, they didn't know for quite some while, until like dinner time, that Andrew wasn't here. He was quite a quiet kid and would often, you know, come home from school, go upstairs and just play video games for a while, so it wasn't that unusual for him, you know, not to be present in the evening. But when they went upstairs to, you know, check on him and found that he wasn't there, that's when they started to get worried. They called his friends, they called any local places that he might be, and nobody had seen him, and they had also said that he wasn't even in school that day. Then they found the mistake that the school made in calling the wrong parents, and so it was thought that perhaps Andrew had maybe got lost or injured or been kidnapped on the way to school. So they spent days driving his route to school, checking in local parks and canals, until 3 days later they actually found out that Andrew had bought the ticket down to London, and so obviously they assumed he went straight there from the house. And then they found the CCTV footage in King's Cross and confirmed that he had actually gotten off and left the station. So the reasons and theories for this one are actually quite varied. One theory says that he wanted to, you know, run away and reinvent himself, and so he fled to London to do that. One says that he was kidnapped somewhere in London, and then there are theories about why he actually went to London in the first place. Obviously there's the one we mentioned earlier about him just wanting to get away and reinvent himself. Another theory said that he had actually gone down to London to see a live metal band by the name of Sixth. He was apparently quite a big fan of this type of music, and this was a super cool band that was playing at a venue nearby and on that day. So maybe he, you know, bunked school, planned to go down to London for the day, see the band, and then either stay the night somewhere in London or head back to Doncaster the same day. He apparently had a bunch of friends and family in London, so it wouldn't be that unusual for him to, you know, arrange a place to stay or something like that. And his dad said that he might have possibly even gone down there just for sightseeing, as he did tend to like London. So yeah, a very sad case that was never solved. Andrew was never found. There was no real footage of him found outside of the CCTV train station footage, although there were a few rumored sightings of him, either on the day or in the following few days, kind of in and around central London. But these were never really fully followed up on, so we can't confirm whether they're true or not. 17 years on, and this case has yet to be solved, but hopefully it will be soon. Antimatter comets. So this is a hypothesized idea that says that comets, these icy, rocky things flying through space can sometimes be made out of entirely, purely antimatter. The idea was thrown around in the 1940s, and honestly, there's not too much basis for it. It never really went past the hypothesized stage, and the idea was that these comets, which were made out of antimatter and would begin to break down as they came into the Earth's atmosphere, as, you know, they were getting like closer to regular matter, and so that was why they were breaking up and potentially exploding, as opposed to the standard accepted belief of it's just the heat and the friction and the gravity, etc., that acts on the comet. They were also theorized to be the explanation for gamma ray bursts and for stuff like ball lightning, but these links at the time were honestly quite weak, and there are, at least now, much better explanations for these phenomena. So yeah, this one's probably more sci-fi than sci, but it might make for a cool story plot. The aquatic ape hypothesis. So this is, to me, a really fun one. This is the theory, or hypothesis if you will, that says that humans, or rather our ancestors, split off from the standard line of apes into the shallow waters. This apparent split and then later convergence back onto land did, according to this theory, help us survive and flourish. So the idea is we were all on land like the other apes, and for some reason we got pushed off the land closer and closer to water. Then we became like, not fishers or anything, but we apparently hunted fish in the water, hunted shellfish and clams, and this led to a few things. One being our relative hairlessness, as you know, the more something is in water, the less hairy it becomes, I guess. Like think of dolphins and whales, say. And another trait was us walking on 2 feet. The idea was that if you're in shallow waters and you're hunting fish and stuff, it's a lot easier to stand on 2 feet, you're a lot lighter, and so this basically helped us develop and allowed us to walk on 2 feet when on land. And the main proponent for this theory, biologist Alistair Hardy, said that this also explains how we developed early tools. As he said, in this theory, we developed early tools in order to, break open shells to, eat the shellfish flesh. And then once we got these abilities of tool making and walking upright and somewhat hairlessness, we then migrated slowly back to land, and these newfound abilities gave us dominance on the land and allowed us to compete and to win and to flourish, and then the rest is history. So a bit of a wild theory, honestly, and the theory isn't too popular or even respected by a lot of prominent biologists, but it is still a possibility, and it is definitely a fun one to think about. The Atlanta murders of 1979 to 1981. So these were a string of murders of young adults and children. Yeah, these were obviously in Atlanta, all within these 2 years. And in 1981, after, experiencing and piecing together and linking a bunch of these murders, the police and the FBI started to really investigate and to even stake out some areas where the killer might be. So they were in a ton of areas, off-roads, forests, fields, obviously not doing it all the time or even covering every single forest, but they thought it was incredibly urgent and important that they do their best to, catch this guy. And one of the areas they staked out was some bridges. And during one of these nights, when they were staking out one of these bridges, the police who were, staking it out in secret, suddenly heard a loud splash. And this was obviously in the water below the bridge. Then they saw a white station wagon kind of pull up and reverse and, drive back along the bridge. And so later down the road, they stopped this station wagon and they started to question the driver. And the person in the car was a man named Wayne Williams, who was a 23-year-old guy who was apparently a music promoter and a professional photographer. He was obviously asked what he was doing, where he was going, etc. And he said that he was on his way to audition a woman called Cheryl Johnson. This was for a singing role apparently, but Cheryl was never actually found or identified or confirmed to even exist at all. So it's thought very likely that he made her up. Police also also saw at the time, which this is important for later, they also saw in the car a nylon rope and a pair of gloves, but they didn't take either of them because at this point in time they weren't really arresting him. They were just kind of investigating him. The station wagon actually belonged to Wayne's parents, and because they didn't find anything below the bridge on that night, they ended up letting him go. And it was only 2 days later that the body of Nathaniel Cater was found floating in the water just downstream from where the bridge was. So at this point they kind of put two and two together and went and arrested Wayne Williams. So with him arrested, they started to interview him and started to investigate him a little more closely. And what they found was honestly quite disturbing. They found witnesses that said that they saw Wayne Williams with Cater, the man who was found in the river, on the night of his disappearance. So that was very suspicious, if not condemning. He had also in previous days and weeks and months been witnessed handing out flyers in various neighborhoods aimed at young people between the ages of 11 and 21, asking them to try out and audition for his band. So I mean, that is incredibly disturbing. They also found that the fibers on his carpet inside of his house actually matched some of the fibers found on a few of the victims. And on top of all that, he failed a polygraph test, which, you know, it's just a polygraph, but as well as all the other stuff, it is pretty convincing. He was eventually convicted of the murder of Nathaniel Cater, the man who was found in the water, and of Jimmy Ray Payne, who was killed earlier in that year. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences for these 2 murders, but the total list of murders consists of like 28 in total, and he was never charged for any of these. Now, there are a few different beliefs about how many people exactly Wayne killed, or whether it was some of the Atlanta murders, or most of them, or even all of them, and a lot of people investigating it at the time, now still to this day, say that they think Williams is very, very likely responsible for them. But a few other investigators say that while Williams likely killed some of them, if not even most of them, they think it's quite likely that there were multiple killers involved in these 28 killings. And they say that people don't want to admit this because it means there are multiple killers still out there, which I guess is a very troubling thought. And so that is the current status of these killings. 2 solved and convicted for, and like 26 completely unsolved with no one charged for them and with no justice brought to them. So a very sad set of cases in general, and this was 40 years ago, so it's not too far back, but it is still quite a way back. There is some chance, I guess, that we will, find some DNA evidence or develop some technology to, retroactively determine who killed them, but it is looking less and less likely every year. Fingers crossed that some of these get solved, and rest in peace to all of the lovely, wonderful victims in this horrific case. So, grab a drink. My choice today is coffee with cream, and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. The Atlanta Ripper was a killer who murdered at least 15 people, at least, in Atlanta between 1909 and 1914. These were all women, and after the first few killings, police started to kind of link them together, and eventually after the 8th woman was found, they, put 2 and 2 together and realized that they had a serial killer on their hands. All of the victims were black women in their 20s, and so obviously black women in their 20s were terrified, especially if they lived or worked in and around the areas that the other bodies were found in. They wouldn't stay out at night, they wouldn't walk, especially not alone, and a lot of them in the local area just refused to go to work whatsoever. And honestly, I can't really blame them. The Ripper seemed to target fairly attractive women who had some semblance of an education, but the reason for the killings in the first place, and for why he targeted this specific demographic of people, was never figured out. They were mostly all killed with a knife and or sharp object, and the killer he was called the Ripper. So you can imagine what he did to the victims with the knife, both before, during, and after he killed them. It was horrific, it was violent, it was gruesome, and it seemed like these deaths weren't just the result of wanting to kill, but also a result of this person wanting to destroy and cause as much pain and damage as possible. And one of the daughters of one of the victims victims, who was actually present during an attack of her mother, witnessed everything and said that she saw the attacker, and described him as a powerfully built, well-dressed, large black man. And partly based on this description, they were able to bring in a few suspects who were questioned, investigated, etc., and then eventually let go. And sadly, tragically, this case was never solved, and the Ripper was never caught. Bruthchaurus. So this was a potential new genus of sauropod, which was found in India in 1978. Obviously, the dinosaur wasn't found, just the fossils, and they have disappointingly actually since dissolved and or disintegrated. So yeah, but if this dinosaur were to exist, just based on these now non-existent fossils, it might very well have been the largest land animal to ever exist. In comparison, the Argentinosaurus is thought to have reached around 35 meters in length, or 115 feet, as I know a lot of you appreciate the unit conversion, and between 65 and 100 tons, which is flippin' huge. But the Bruthchaurus is thought to have been upwards of 47 meters, or 154 feet in length, and up to 220 tons, which is just insane. This would have been both longer and heavier than the largest blue whale to ever exist, which sat at around 30 meters, 98 feet in length, and around 200 tons. And bear in mind, this dinosaur would have been on land, which makes it at least relatively even heavier. So yeah, this was a huge, giant dinosaur, or rather potential dinosaur, as we never had the full skeleton for it, and the stuff that we, did have is now disintegrated, but hopefully more will turn up. But until then, this potentially world's largest creature will remain a bit of a mystery. And our next mystery is why you aren't subscribed. I mean, what the heck, guys? Join the family, it takes a second, it's free, and you get us one step closer to our goal of 100 billion subscribers. So welcome aboard. Buridan's ass, or Buridan's donkey, is a paradox, a thought experiment, and it's the idea that you have a donkey that is both equally thirsty and equally hungry, and it is placed exactly in between a bucket of water and a stack of hay. And this is sometimes represented as a donkey, sometimes as a man, and sometimes instead of food and water, there are two identical collections of food on either side. So say a man in the middle with two pizzas either side, and he is starving, but because he can't make a decision between the two different pizzas, I mean, I say different, they are identical if you can imagine, so it doesn't matter whatsoever which pizza you pick, as they are both exactly the same, but this indecision leads to the person not deciding either way, and then they end up starving to death. This is a interesting paradox, and I think we actually experience it ourselves more often than we might think. We can't decide between two or more different restaurants, so we just don't go out to eat. We can't decide which show to watch, so we just don't end up watching anything. And if we're starting a new project or company, we can't decide what to name the company, we can't decide what color the logo should be, and this chronic indecision just leads to us not creating anything whatsoever. So, as I said, it's an interesting paradox and an interesting visualization of that paradox. The burnt house horizon. So this one was absolutely fascinating to look into. It refers to this huge area in southeastern Europe in which archaeologists have found evidence for mass house burning. Like, it's really strange. This was all the way back in 6500 BC up until around 2000 BC. So for like 4,000 years, give or take. The houses were burnt, even entire villages and communities, like mass violent burning, so much so that the clay they used to build their houses ended up cooking essentially into like ceramic, almost as if you put the whole thing in a kiln. And as well as this, it would almost completely destroy the house, and it would scorch the rubble and rock. And these burnings would occur, as I said, every roughly 70 to 80 years for roughly 4,000 plus years over this entire huge area. Now that is what happened, but why happened is another question entirely. The main two splits in thought about why it happened generally comes from whether you believe the fires were accidentally started or whether they were deliberately started. There's evidence for both, of course, so it's not exactly a super obvious cut and dry issue. On one hand, a bunch of these sites had seemingly large amounts of food stored there, which also were found burnt in the remains of these houses. So it was thought that these people wouldn't just, willingly burn all of their food stock, so they must have been accidents sort of thing. And it was argued that these houses basically had ovens in them. Well, I mean, they did have ovens in them, but the argument was that these ovens might lead to accidents occurring, and as a result, the house would catch fire and you would get the results that we see today. And these were two of the main arguments, you could say, for these fires starting accidentally. But in my opinion, the slightly more likely argument is that these fires were set on purpose. And we'll get into the reasons why these might have been set deliberately in just a little bit. But I want to mention a pretty cool experiment that was done, where they built basically replica models of these houses, you know, trying to get as accurate as possible to how these houses might have looked, what they might have been built from, with clay walls, indoor ovens, thatched roofs, and then they accidentally lit a fire in these houses in the most likely way that a fire might have started, with the inside ovens, and then they let this fire burn untouched for over 30 hours. And when they then checked on the house, most of the stuff inside and of the house had been burnt up, the roof was burnt away, but most importantly to their conclusion, less than 1% of the clay that was used to build the house ended up being converted to ceramic. So from this experiment, it didn't seem likely that these accidental fires could have resulted in the large amounts of solid ceramic that we find in the remains of these houses. They theorized that in order for a fire to have been sustained for this long and to burn at as high a temperature as would have been needed to essentially, you know, cook all of this clay, there would have needed to have been some extra fuel, you know, extra wood, extra kindling, stacked in and around the house before the fire was lit, essentially turning the houses deliberately into giant furnaces and producing the results that we see today. So if these ancient people did this, the next question obviously is why? Why would you destroy your own buildings, your own homes, your own possessions, your own resources? And that is a very good question. Why? One obvious theory comes from the idea of sacrifice. You know, people used to sacrifice honestly a lot worse than just their food. So that's one idea. Another theory was that this was in response to an early plague, you know, that spread out and ravaged this entire area. And so they figured out, you know, that burning the bodies, burning the infected, setting fire to the homes would essentially completely get rid of the plague and disinfect the entire area, which it's certainly a possibility. And the fact that these were done every X amount of years also kind of holds up, as plagues were known for, you know, kind of coming and going over the years. And if someone was infected and they're in their home, like, you don't really know what they've touched. The floor might be infected, their possessions might be. So maybe it was just safer for them to burn the person and burn all of their possessions and the entire home. Some other theories range from the houses being burnt to essentially secure and weatherproof them, you know, melt and bind the seals and the waterproofing sort of thing, to the fires being a result of warfare over the years. So, you know, invading people would come in, kill everyone, burn down the villages sort of thing. But for this one, we don't actually find really any evidence of death or fighting or warfare in this area at the times that the fires were lit. So that theory, I think, is a little weak. Another one says that, similar to the plague theory, if you don't want to go as far as, you know, plague, maybe they were used to cleanse and smoke out pests of some kind, whether that's mites, fleas, I don't know, wasps, ants. And another theory says that these fires were just a symbolic sending off, if you will, of the houses themselves. So once they were no longer in use, or maybe when the last occupant of the house died, these houses were set alight, had kind of like a house funeral, if you will, and then they were remade fresh by the new tenant, if you will. Quite a few theories on this one, and quite a few interesting ones to at least think about. And it is kind of wild to imagine what life might have been like for the people back then, and why these often huge areas would be set alight, burning communities and homes and villages, and, you know, what the mindset and culture and community might have been like. Hopefully we'll come up with more evidence and theories for this one, as it is, at least to me, super interesting. The Carroll A. Deering was a ship found quite mysteriously abandoned off the coast of North Carolina in 1921. 1921. This was a fairly large sailing ship and was designed primarily to take cargo and people and, shipments to and from place to place. It was built, deployed, and had been in use for only round about a year when in 1921 it planned to set sail to Brazil to deliver a large shipment of coal. Now, somewhat relevant to this story is that the captain of the ship was a man named William H. Merritt, who was honestly a pretty cool, pretty skillful, pretty well-liked captain, and his son, Cyril Merritt, was the first mate of the ship, so like second in command basically. So they left Virginia in 1920 loaded with all of this cargo and headed for Brazil where they would eventually deliver it. But the captain, William H. Merritt, fell seriously ill while they were on their way to Brazil, and so they had to stop the ship, turn it around, and head back a little ways up to Delaware to drop off both the captain and his son. The company in charge of the shipment and of the ship then hired another captain and another first mate, and this is where things started to get a little bit uneasy. This new captain, Willis B. Wormel, seemed to not get along too well with the rest of the crew or with the new first mate, Charles B. McClellan, and normally, first mates are more connected with the actual crew members. Like, they're charged with the minor interactions, with seeing how the crew is doing, with talking to them, with disciplining them, etc. While the captain kind of manages everything from, a bird's eye sort of view, because he's dealing with the crew members and the navigation and the engineers and all that sort of thing. But not only did Captain Wormel quite outwardly dislike a lot of the crew, he also didn't let McClellan, the first mate, do his job in managing them. They made it all the way down to Brazil, delivered the shipment, and here Wormel basically met up with another captain that he knew and just started to badmouth the whole of his crew. And then after Brazil, they headed back up to North America, stopping in Barbados along the way. So when they stopped here, McClellan, the first mate, got really drunk at a bar and started complaining about Captain Wormel, how he was useless and rude and he wouldn't even let him discipline his own crew members. He said that Wormel constantly wasn't trusting him with things, would just butt in and intervene and wouldn't let him do his job. And Wormel apparently had quite bad eyesight, so McClellan had to do a lot of the navigation as well. So he was basically doing most of the work while being shouted at all the time and without properly being able to control his crew. So yeah, as I said, one night he just got really drunk and said that he would, and I quote, get the captain before they got back to Norfolk, or before they got home to America, basically. And he was actually arrested drunk that night, but Wormel forgave him for the stuff that he said, bailed him out of jail, and brought him back on board to head back home to America. So that was it for that part. They left Barbados, headed back northwards, and were next spotted by a lightship, which is basically just like a ship that acts as a lighthouse, which is pretty cool. But they were spotted by this lightship near Cape Lookout off North Carolina. The lightship's keeper, Captain Jacobson, said that a tall, thin man with red hair and a foreign accent was speaking to him through a megaphone, and this man clearly wasn't Captain Wormel and likely wasn't a mate. He said he shouted to him that the ship's anchors had been lost in a storm and asked that the ship's company, G.D. Deering Company, be notified of this. Captain Jacobson apparently noted this message down, but he couldn't broadcast or send the message outwards as his radio had apparently stopped working, which is unfortunate. Then the next day, another ship saw the Deering heading for this area called the Diamond Shoals, which is an area well known for causing shipwrecks due to its shallow waters and constantly shifting sand barriers or sandbars. And the whole area is known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic. It's scary. And it is thought to be responsible for upwards of 600 shipwrecks over the years. So yeah, this is not the sort of place you want to be sailing towards. This ship that saw the Deering, however, didn't try to, alert or wave it down or anything, as they assumed that the ship and the captain knew of this area, as it wasn't exactly a secret, and just assumed that they knew what they were doing and that they would steer away from it eventually soon, or the crew would eventually spot the local lighthouse or the local Diamond Shoals lightship, which was stationed just out after the graveyard, kind of like a last warning for people sort of thing. But apparently none of these warnings actually took, as the ship was next seen just on the outer side of the Diamond Shoals, seemingly fully grounded and unmoving. The rescue crew weren't able to board the ship for another 3 days, mostly due to bad weather, and after boarding the Deering, what they found painted a wild story. This ship was apparently completely abandoned. The steering equipment was damaged, the wheel was shattered, the rudder was disengaged, the ship's logs and navigational equipment were missing, as was most of the crew's belongings and the 2 lifeboats. And the rescuers eventually tried to salvage and secure the ship, tried to wrestle it free of the ground, bring it back to shore, but it was more difficult and dangerous than it seemed. And so they decided to, I kid you not, blow it up with dynamite in order to prevent it being a hazard for other vessels. Now, what exactly happened to the crew and the captain and the ship is still a little unclear, but just a few months later, a message in a bottle turned up, found by a local fisherman, and this was just offshore North Carolina. He handed it in to the police, and the message read as follows: Deering captured by oil-burning boat, something like chaser, taking off everything, handcuffing crew hiding all over ship, no chance to escape. Finder, please notify headquarters, Deering. The handwriting was identified as being likely from the ship's engineer, Henry Bates, and the bottle itself was proven to be manufactured in Brazil, where the ship had just made their last delivery. So, pretty eerie. Then it was also discovered that Captain Jacobson, who we mentioned earlier, the captain of the lightship, also spotted another ship after he spotted the Deering, and he said he tried to hail down the ship in order to relay the message that the Deering had given him, as his radio wasn't working. But this other ship didn't respond, didn't stop, and had actually hidden the name of their ship by hanging some cloth over the edge of the ship. So all of these things combined convinced everyone that there was some foul play afoot. But this message in the bottle was later found out to be a forgery, written and invented by the very same fisherman who found it. Apparently he was hoping for some publicity and fame of some kind, and that was basically as far as the investigation went. As I said, the ship was eventually just blown up. None of the crew members were ever found again, and theories about what might have happened ranged from the natural, like just bad weather, as there were apparently quite a few really bad hurricanes and storms in the area at the time, to a pirate attack, to a mutiny, so all the crew rebelling essentially against the captain, throwing him overboard, and then getting stuck in bad weather or these shallow waters, and then perhaps trying to take the lifeboats out to safety and just getting washed away into the ocean, never to be seen again. Then there are these slightly more obscure theories, like the Russians trying to board and hijack the ship, and the crew members purposefully destroying the ship's wheel and the navigational system, and potentially deliberately running it into the Diamond Shoals in order to stop the Russians boarding and taking it. To a really interesting theory, which I may cover later on in the Iceberg, but basically when the Deering was found, it had these 2 red distress signals lit on the top of the ship. And there was another boat, a steamboat, the Hewitt, that was known to have been in the area at the time and could have potentially seen these distress signals. The Hewitt itself, not long after this, completely vanished, and so this theory says that the Hewitt saw the distress signals, went to the Deering, rescued everyone on board, and then shortly after went down itself, taking with it its entire crew as well as the entire rescued crew of the Deering, which might explain why they were never found. So a few theories out there, no official explanation was ever given for this, and still to this day, this case, this ship, this captain and crew are part of one of the most mysterious maritime cases in modern history, the Chamberlain Molon planetesimal hypothesis. So this is a mostly debunked theory of how the planets in our solar system and in any solar system formed. It was proposed in 1905 by Thomas Chamberlain, who was a geologist, and Forrest Molon, who was an astronomer. And the theory said that when a star forms, that's basically it. It just forms on its own, and it has no planets around it. And for a collection of planets to form around it, it requires another passing star. And when this passing star comes by this other star, the gravity from it pulls a bunch of the star outwards, and this some of the star that was pulled out eventually breaks up and forms and rotates around the sun, forming planets. A reasonable hypothesis for the time, I guess. And a further idea was when this passing star pulled out some of the matter from the other star, the rotation of this star caused the matter to form sort of a spiral around the star. And so when looking out into space, we saw several spiral-armed objects, and they assumed with this theory that these were other stars going through this, planet creation process. We now know that these are indeed other galaxies, and this theory was later almost completely debunked when mathematicians determined that in order for matter, say, to fly out as far as Jupiter is, it would need enough momentum that it would just completely break out of the orbit of the sun altogether and exit the solar system. So yeah, a mostly debunked hypothesis, but still a fun one. Confederate gold refers to the large amount of gold kept by the Confederacy and seemingly never found again during the American Civil War. During the invasion of New Orleans by the North, the Confederates apparently moved millions of dollars worth of gold out to Columbus, Georgia. Then the Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard was ordered to take this gold from Columbus, and the bank manager refused. Beauregard pointed guns at him, and eventually he came over to his side. He handed the gold over to Beauregard, but what happened to the gold after this is more or less a mystery. There are a bunch of wild theories on this one, a few of which I might cover in my upcoming, well, I won't go into what my next iceberg will be, but I think you'll really like it. Some of the theories include the gold still being hidden somewhere, maybe in preparation for a future Confederate uprising, and these somewheres range from being put on a ship and sinking off the coast of Africa, to it being buried under Alcatraz prison, to even, as shown in the film Time Cop, to have been taken by a time traveler to the 20th century in order to pay off some criminals. So yeah, some wild ideas and theories out there. Some of them are quite clearly fiction, some of them are a little more reasonable, but the bottom line is nobody really knows where that gold went. Whether it was simply all used up for the war effort, or was captured and taken by the North after they won, or is still hiding somewhere out there, ready to be uncovered by some fortunate and very lucky treasure hunter. Who knows? The copper cauldrons of Siberian Valley. So these were these super interesting, mysterious copper cauldrons or structures protruding from the ground found in Siberia going back thousands of years. So for some background, this was in the Siberian taiga, which is this huge area of roughly like 4 million kilometers, and at least a few 100,000 square kilometers of that are completely uninhabited and unmapped, which is just a bonkers number. Like, compare this to the Yellowstone National Park, which is huge in its own right. Like, you could very easily get lost in that park, but that is only around 9,000 square kilometers. So yeah, 9,000 square kilometers compared to 4 million square kilometers. Just a huge area. But these rumors and legends of these giant copper cauldrons go all the way back to the times of the folklore in the local area, and the people in the immediate and surrounding areas were said to have called these Olgrus, which I have no idea how to pronounce that. Might be Olgis, Olgris, Ogris, I have no idea. But it translates into cauldrons, and they were said to have been forged out of an unknown metal, were the color of copper but incredibly hard, and with very sharp edges. Going in or near these cauldrons would cause dizziness, nausea, sickness, and eventually death. And so the folks who wrote this lore declared this area as cursed and labeled it the Valley of Death, quite appropriately. They also noted that over time these cauldrons were slowly sinking into the ground and into the ice and snow, which might explain why these are apparently becoming harder and harder to find and locate. They were described as looking kind of like odd houses, smooth with an opening on the top that was either like circular or a dome. When you entered them, they would lead lead down a winding staircase and then branch off into other rooms, all made of metal. They were said to be actually quite warm inside, and it was really only in the 18 and 1900s that encounters with these cauldrons started to be, written down and noted and documented, and some of these accounts were really quite interesting. One said that the vegetation around the cauldron was flourishing, all of the wildlife was brighter and bigger than the other wildlife out in the wilderness, and this might have been due to the heat produced by these things, or maybe to the minerals being, let off by these things. We're not really sure. And one group who went out there in the 1940s actually spent a night inside one of these cauldrons, and one member of the group who was, lying on their side sort of thing, ended up losing all of their hair and developed these wounds, these sores that would never heal on the side of their face that they were lying on. So this hints, at least to me, something like it being radioactive in a way. And as I said, this area is absolutely huge, and the landscape is always shifting and changing, and new plants and growths and trees growing and falling down. So it's really, really hard to map it out and to track people's eyewitnesses and experiences back to these certain cauldrons. So almost every expedition that went out there over the years found almost nothing and came back empty-handed. And eventually the last person, the last eyewitness to ever claim seeing one of these cauldrons died. So what do you logically do at this point? Well, you fly over the entire area in a motorized parachute, obviously. And that's exactly what this one group ended up doing. They flew over dozens of areas of suspected locations for these cauldrons and were constantly looking out for anything that might stick out. And they did end up spotting something strange and odd and circular in the wilderness. So they landed, they went up to the location of interest, and while they didn't find a cauldron, they did find a large circular pond. This was a strange, small, frozen pond that had a small, tiny island in its center. So they went to the center of the pond to inspect it further and deduced that this may very well have been a cauldron that, due to its heat, had slowly sunken into the ground, and also due to the heat, melted the ground and ice and snow around it, forming this liquid water which froze on the outer parts, and in the center on the island part, well, it was still liquid there. So the outer parts froze, the inner parts that were still close to the warm cauldron ended up staying as liquid water. It flooded the entire cauldron, and I mean, it is, to me at least, a little convincing and might explain why a lot of these are going out of sight. This idea was further reinforced by the fact that one of the crew members that night started to feel dizzy, faint, sick, couldn't eat, couldn't drink. So, a lot of these symptoms that were kind of associated with these cauldrons. So partly due to this sickness, the expedition just decided to call it quits there and left back to civilization. Probably a wise decision, but they didn't come back empty-handed, as they did find a chunk of titanium ore, which apparently they could have sold the coordinates to say the Russians, for a fairly decent price. As, where this titanium was found might indicate a spot where more rare metals and minerals could be found, and so could be mined and procured. So were these, as some people think, crashed UFOs, possibly emitting passive radiation still? Were they alien weapons installed in the ground in order to fire out at meteors and asteroids to, protect our planet? Which is a very wild but interesting theory. Or were they just giant, deep pockets of ore, minerals, metals in an area that is, kind of somewhat known for being rich in these resources, and just due to their weight and latent heat, ended up slowly melting down and sinking into the land below? It's a possibility, but who really knows? I do think all of the theories are pretty cool though. Cyber Anakin is a computer hacker that even as a teenager started to hack and leak tons of information, emails, passwords, addresses, and much more of mainly Russian news sites and Russian email providers in retaliation originally for Russia shooting down Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. Then he used all of this leaked info to track down a man who had been harassing female chess players, which is pretty noble. And he also arranged it so that this official North Korean website, which was a propaganda site, instead linked to this fake Twitter account that posted anti-North Korea photos, propaganda of its own, information, and insults towards Kim Jong-un. So, pretty funny. He has done a bunch of these high-profile hackings over the years, and he seems to be quite good at them, especially since he's never been caught, and as such, his identity has never been revealed. Disrupted planets are planets that have either been disrupted, or partially or completely destroyed, by larger bodies like stars or other planets. These planets or bodies end up becoming destroyed, end up breaking into gas or dust or debris, and end up often orbiting their star, and this results in an uneven debris disk forming around the star and leading to these fluctuations in the brightness of the star. That's the theory anyway. Planet gets destroyed, forms dust, and this dust orbits the star, which partially and periodically blocks some of the light from that star. A cool little theory, but it's mostly theoretical, and so the confirmed cause for these fluctuations in brightness is still unconfirmed and is still somewhat a mystery. Dorothy Arnold was an American well-to-do woman who disappeared in New York in 1910. She was 25 years old, she was rich, her family was rich, her pet gerbil, if she had one, was rich. They had a lot of money. And she was out one day in December shopping for a dress. She bought some chocolates in a store, ran into a good friend of hers, and the friend described her as being completely fine and in good spirits. She then told her friend that she was planning on walking through Central Park and then was planning to head home. And that was the last time that she was ever seen. Her family initially wanted to keep this on the down low, you know, keep this undercover sort of thing. And so instead of contacting the police, they hired a bunch of private investigators. And when that proved fruitless, they eventually did file a missing persons report with the police. But this was weeks after Dorothy had actually gone missing, not just hours or days. Like, the private investigators were all doing investigations of their own, they were doing interviews, they were collecting evidence for weeks, even up until months after Dorothy's disappearance. So because they took so long to actually tell the police about this, the family, after the disappearance came out, was, quite rightfully I think, heavily criticized by their friends and by the community. There were theories that she had been abducted or kidnapped, or that she had slipped while walking through the park, maybe banged her head and was now suffering from amnesia, or in fact actually died from the fall. But they checked a bunch of hospital and doctor records and couldn't really find any evidence for this one. There was no apparent ransom notes or demands of any kind, which, you know, you'd expect there to be if you kidnapped the daughter of a super rich person. There were also theories that she felt quite sad and down after her writing work was rejected by a publisher, and she wrote of only seeing a long road ahead with no turning, and that mother would always think it was an accident, if you see what I mean. So, you know, that is also a possibility. And there was another theory that said that Dorothy was secretly pregnant, and she was getting her pregnancy taken care of in an illegal clinic, and then she ended up dying from complications, and her body was disposed of, which is a horrible thing to think about. But this last theory became more widely accepted, you could say, when an illegal underground clinic was found and raided in Pennsylvania a few years later. And one of the doctors who worked there testified that Dorothy had actually been there and had actually died there, and that they had cremated her body in secret. So yeah, pretty messed up. But that is if you believe these doctors, of course, which a few of the investigators at the time didn't believe the doctors, and so that avenue was never really pursued too heavily. There were also apparent sightings and letters from Dorothy, but these, again, never really went anywhere, as the letters at the time were thought to be forgeries or pranks, and the sightings were determined not to be accurate or not to be Dorothy when they were followed up on. Her family did hold quite strongly to the belief that she was still alive and maybe might have, you know, run away for some reason, possibly with a man, but the police at the time firmly believed that she was dead, and so they ended their investigations, and Dorothy was never found. And what happened to her on that fateful December day in 1910 will likely forever remain a mystery. So grab a drink, my choice today is chai, and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. The double murder in Shenandoah National Park. hike. So this was an unsolved, seemingly senseless murder of 2 women in 1996. Julian Williams and Laura Winans were a young couple who were just huge fans of the outdoors, of hiking, and at the time they were on a trip in the wilderness near the Shenandoah's Skyland Resort in 1996. The two were a lesbian couple who had met just 2 years earlier, and Julianne in particular was trying to reconcile being a lesbian with being a Christian, as in her head these were 2 things that she felt very strongly about, and she was working incredibly hard at trying to integrate them. And she actually started a church group called Church Ladies to try and help and make other gay and lesbian people joining her church feel more loved, more cared for, more understood, more welcome. And she actually met Laura not in this group, but in a group called Woods Women, which was designed basically as like a women's outdoor group. You know, they would go on treks, they would go on hikes, and as I said, at the time the couple were out hiking, camping, along with their pet dog Taj, and all of a sudden they just went missing. Soon after, there was obviously a search started, and initially they found the women's dog, and soon after, somewhat nearby, they found the bodies of both Laura and Julianne, and it was not a pretty scene. Both women had been stripped down, they were bound, they were gagged, and they had their throats slit. And tragically enough, the 2 women were only out on this hike to actually celebrate Julianne getting a new job. Now, after the initial shock of the discovery, there were quite a few questions surrounding this case about who attacked them, why they attacked them, whether it was just an unlucky, spur-of-the-moment sort of attack, or whether these women were hunted and targeted. Was the targeting random, or was it because of, say, their sexuality? Was this the work of a serial killer, or was this just an isolated incident? A lot of questions. Now, the evidence for this one was very, very sparse. As I said, they were basically in the woods with no cameras, no evidence, no footage, no witnesses, and the only real evidence that they found was from the duct tape that was used to bind the women, and on this duct tape they found some male hairs that actually matched somewhat the DNA of a serial killer named Richard Evans. The match wasn't like 100% or completely definitive. It was like, that's kind of close to him, I guess. And so the FBI asked that these tests be done again to double check things to try and run it through, but they never were. Richard died just a few years after this, and so he was never charged for these killings. And that is basically where the investigation ended. They're still receiving the odd tip here and there, and the case is still open, but it's now been almost 30 years in a cold case with no real leads or suspects. Hopefully something comes up soon, but just to be brutally honest, it doesn't look like it will. The Dumler family was a brutal case involving 3 members of the Dumler family. On October 22nd, 1969, an unidentified person was in the Dumler's home, which they got into seemingly somehow, as there was no signs of forced entry or breaking and entering, so it seems like either they were let in or they snuck in somehow. And they took Martin and Patricia Dumler and Patricia's mother upstairs before tying them all up and shooting them to death. The killer then untied the 3 victims, left the house, and came back around an hour later and stabbed Martin and Patricia in the chest with a knife. So just an insane incident, horrifically brutal, and especially coming back after they were dead to apparently do more damage, to finish the job. Like, it's really messed up. The couple's 2 kids, who were both children, were sleeping at the time downstairs, and they didn't wake up while all of this was going on, and thankfully they weren't attacked or hurt during all of this. This part honestly made me tear up a little bit while reading it, but the murders were actually discovered when the 2 children, aged just 4 and 5, ran out to a neighbor's house the next morning and said that they couldn't wake up mummy and daddy, which it just breaks my heart to imagine children going through something like this. There was very little evidence for this one. The scene was almost completely clean of DNA. There were no witnesses. As I said, there was no sign of forced entry into the house. Nothing either in the house or on the victims was missing, so it doesn't seem like a robbery was very likely. And during the police investigation, they interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They conducted polygraphs, followed up on dozens and dozens of tips and suggestions, and still no obvious suspect stood out. I say no obvious suspect, but there were some suspects. One was a relative of Martin's who worked in the same paper company that Martin was just about to inherit from his father, and another was a man who belonged to the same country club as Martin, who some of Martin's family members saw this man as quite suspicious. And that's kind of as far as they got. No one was ever charged with these killings. The case is 55 years old at this point, and it doesn't seem likely to be solved really anytime soon. But as I said, thank God that the children in this weren't harmed, but it still must have been pretty rough for them to have gone through this. The Dunedin bombing is a very strange, mysterious case. It involved the lawyer James Patrick Ward in Dunedin, New Zealand, and he was facing an appeal at the time, and when asked how the appeal was going by a colleague, he told them that he would most likely definitely win the appeal, unless, I don't know, he got a bomb in the mail the next morning or something. And the next morning, he literally got a bomb in the mail. The package was delivered, it was handed to him, and at 9 a.m. while in his office, he opened the package and it exploded. His left hand was completely obliterated, and he suffered severe damage to his chest and upper body. He was of course rushed to hospital, but sadly he died the same day. There was no apparent or obvious motive for this one, but there clearly must have been some motive for someone to plan this, build the bomb, send it out, and potentially and actually kill someone. Like, there must have been some reason. James was described as a bit difficult to work with, but then again, he was a lawyer, so that's not really saying much. He had some enemies, but again, he was a lawyer, so that is not too unusual, but none that hated him enough to literally send a freaking bomb in the post to him. The parcel itself was a wooden box filled with plastic explosives with an electric trigger and a detonator. James's brother-in-law John was a major suspect in this case, as he quite openly hated James and had experience during World War II of making bombs. And also he had a history of being a little bit mentally unstable, but whoever sent the bomb, whether it was John, was incredibly careful about leaving any evidence at all. And so, because John denied everything in the interviews that he had, the police had no real evidence to pin this on him. And so John was never charged. It has been over 60 years since this incident happened, and aside from the case being extremely deadly and brutal, what really stands out is James seemingly predicting his own death and predicting receiving a bomb in the mail, which is all sorts of weird, whether it was just sheer luck or sheer bad luck, or maybe somehow he knew about the plot, which to me doesn't really seem likely, but it is what it is. The 2024 subscriber case is the unsolved mystery of why you are not subscribed. It's the best way to stay notified of all the new mystery videos, Iceberg videos, and many more that will be coming in the next few months, and you get us one step closer to our goal of 108 billion subscribers. So hit the red button and join the family. Dwayne McCorkindale was the case of a man found dead at a highway rest stop in Oklahoma in 1988. At around 8 p.m, someone called in the body, found just next to a phone booth, and when police arrived, they determined it to be the body of 27-year-old truck driver Dwayne McCorkindale. He had apparently been robbed. His manner of death was a shotgun blast, close range to the back, and there were no witnesses or suspects. And police first suspected that the killer may have actually stalked Dwayne here to this particular rest stop and phone booth, as according to other truck drivers in the area, Dwayne was chatting away to other drivers on his radio, and he mentioned that he was going to stop off at this particular truck stop and call his wife. So police thought someone may have been in the area, had one of these radios, heard Dwayne saying this, and then decided to ambush him. So that was something that they were on the lookout for. So after announcing his plan on the radio, Dwayne stopped off at this rest stop, got out of his truck, went to the phone booth, and took out some change, ready to make a call. When, apparently suddenly, without even having time to turn around, Dwayne was shot from behind with a shotgun, and according to the investigators, he was dead before he even hit the ground. The change that he had in his hand was just strewn everywhere. His wallet and his keys were taken, and the value totaled up to like $25, which killing for this amount is just an absurdity. I mean, killing for any amount is, but this amount especially. And the fact that he was shot so quickly and from behind means likely that the people didn't ask him for anything, as you know, he would have probably turned around. There probably wasn't an altercation or a fight. It seems like it was just a instant killing. And eventually they came to the conclusion that one of the major suspects for this case wasn't a person, but rather a car. So when the investigation started and the calls were opened up for people to, report sightings, report tips, quite a few calls came in about a brown Ford Pinto that was apparently equipped with a trucker's CB radio and was being an absolute menace on and around the roads roughly in this area. This brown Pinto would apparently be driving super erratically. They would be tailgating trucks and other cars, swerving in and out of lanes incredibly quickly, and sometimes truckers would, turn on the radio, try and have a word with them, to say, relax, you're driving insanely, like you're honestly gonna get someone killed. And they would get replies from the brown Pinto saying like, watch who you're talking to, you don't know who you're messing with, we have killed one trucker and we will kill again if you get in our way. The people in this car were reported to be one black male, one white male, and sometimes a white woman with them, and these were seen as the main prime suspects. But they were never found, they were never identified, nor was the car, and so the people were never investigated or interviewed. A few other truckers apparently had some kind of close calls with this brown Pinto before, it sped off, never to be seen again. But as I said, the people and the car were never identified, and Dwayne's seemingly senseless murder was never solved. The Edgecombe County serial killer. So this was a serial killer thought to be connected to up to 11 victims between 2005 and 2009. They were all involved in, adult work and all had various problems with addiction. So once again, very sad to see these troubled, vulnerable women being taken advantage of in this most extreme way possible, being killed. And in this investigation, there wasn't really too much evidence to be found, but they did find male evidence on one of the victims, Tara Nicholson, and they eventually linked this DNA to a man named Antoine Pittman, who was a convicted felon living relatively nearby. He was eventually convicted and charged for the death of Tara Nicholson, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But he never was, nor was anyone else, charged for these other 10 murders. And police do think that they are all linked to one killer, and so, if Antoine committed one of these murders, at least police think he likely committed the others, but he was never officially linked to them, and so the cases of these 10 other women sadly remain unsolved. Emily Sage's ghost twin. And that last name is a little funny, I'm not too sure how to say it. Might be Sage, might be Sage, might be Sagi, but we'll just go with Sage. So we go from provable, tangible, physical murders to, well, whatever this case is. Emily Sage was a school teacher who had been teaching for 16 years in Europe in the 1800s. She apparently, according to reports at the time, was haunted by a mirror image of herself for many, many years. Students would sometimes report seeing Miss Sage up on the blackboard, writing something out, but also see a mirror image right next to her, seemingly mirroring everything that she did. They would say they saw Miss Sage out in the garden picking flowers, say, whilst also at the exact same time see her sitting in a chair in her classroom. And when they went into the classroom to try and touch Miss Sage, their hands went straight through as if she was an apparition of some sort, and eventually she then disappeared. This all terribly frightened the kids. There were rumors of her being haunted by a, mirror, doppelganger, ghost sort of thing, or of her being able to project her image somehow, like appearing in 2 different places at the same time. But either way, the kids, the students, started to tell their parents, and then the parents started to slowly take them all out of school. And eventually, only 12 of the 42 students in school were still attending. So because of this, and because of the reports, the principal of the school was really left with no choice but to fire Miss Sage. And when they fired her, she actually revealed that she had worked in 19 schools over the last 16 years, which is obviously more than one new school every single year. She was apparently shocked, like, this keeps happening, but she was quite used to it by now. After this, she left the school, but was never seen from again. She was a very mysterious figure, and due to some discrepancies in the records, there were rumors about whether she herself were a ghost, or whether she was just hard to pinpoint, as maybe she had changed her name quite a few times over the years, as, you know, being fired 19 times in 16 years isn't really a great look for your record. So honestly, who really knows? But I think, at least for me, it is a very fun, classic, traditional mystery sort of story that I am always a huge fan of. Flyby anomalies is a pretty basic one. It's essentially a discrepancy or difference between the speed we'd predict a spacecraft to be going and the actual speed that we measure it at. The differences are honestly quite minimal, and I think it could come down to a miscalculation in the prediction or a miscalculation in the measurement of the speed, but I guess it is technically a mystery as to what causes this discrepancy. Not a great one, but there you go. The Fort Worth missing trio. So this was a trio, these 3 girls who went missing in 1974, Texas. These 3 girls were Mary Rachel Trelitza, Lisa Renee Wilson, and Julie Ann Mosley, aged 17, 14, and 9 respectively. It was 1974 and the 3 girls were out Christmas shopping, and they went to the Seminary South shopping center to buy clothes and Christmas gifts. They arrived at the mall at around noon and planned to be home at no later than 4 o'clock. Many witnesses saw the 3 girls in the mall on the day, and they seemed to be just fine, happily shopping, and they weren't with anyone else. But when the 3 girls didn't arrive home, their parents naturally went looking for them, and when they went to the mall, they found the car that the girls had arrived there in, driven by the older girl, but the 3 girls were nowhere to be seen. Strangely enough, the clothes and the gifts and the bags that the girls had bought were all in the car, so it seems very likely that the girls had at least made it this far back before whatever happened. The parents waited all night in the car park beside the car for the girls to return, but they never did. The police were obviously called, and initially they thought the girls might have run away. A letter was sent by apparently Rachel to her husband Tommy, and yes, she was only 17, but she was married at the time, and Tommy received the letter the day after the disappearance. And I said earlier it was apparently from Rachel, because even though it was signed off with Love Rachel, there were a few things which were a little bit off about the letter. The letter itself was written in ink and was quite a bit wider than the envelope, and the stuff on the envelope was written in pencil. The letter was addressed to Thomas as opposed to the more informal Tommy that Rachel normally called him. Some of the names, the words, the zip code of the letter were either incorrect or written over or mistaken, and the whole thing seemed a bit strange. But that's kind of as far as the letter went, as both the FBI and law enforcement weren't actually ever really to determine whether Rachel had written this letter, or whether it was written by someone else, or who that someone else might have been. The families of the girls, it should be noted, believed that Rachel did not write this letter, and that the 3 girls did not run away. And they worked, understandably, absolutely tirelessly over the years, raising money for rewards, organizing searches, collecting tips, and they even hired a private investigator, Detective John Swaim. He found a few more witnesses over the years. One guy worked in a store that Rachel had apparently applied for a job at, and this guy was found to have been taking phone numbers from job applications of young women applying and anonymously harassing them with phone calls that were quite creepy and inappropriate, which is obviously wrong and creepy, but he was ruled out as a suspect for the murders. There were other reports of the girls being seen in different places, which when investigated just turned out not to be the girls. There were reports of murders taking place, of bodies being found, and when these were investigated, they were either different bodies, so not the girls, or they were mistaken events or just prank calls, and the girls were, even after all of these years, never found. Years later, a few second-hand witnesses came forward. So, you know, these people didn't witness the girls going missing, but they knew someone who said something about someone else they knew. So like a witness that's basically untraceable. And they said that they saw these men forcing the girls into a yellow truck in the parking lot. So, you know, either these reports are false, but even then it's like, why make something like this up? Or they're real, in which case, why in the fuck would they not have come forward with this this sooner. Those reports never really went anywhere, and so that is where the case remains to this day. John Swaim later died in 1979 and ordered that upon his death, all records and tips and stuff that he received in regards to this case be destroyed, which I don't know why you'd want to destroy them. Like, surely you'd want as much evidence and information out there to help find these girls, but that is where it sits to this day. Fullerton John Doe. So this was an unidentified man who died in traffic in 1987. This was in Orange County, California. He was roughly 30 to 40 years old, 6 feet tall, and he had no identification on him. They ran his dental records, they ran his fingerprints, but received no matches, and so he was listed as a John Doe. Not much on this one, but there you go. Gary DeVore was an American screenwriter who went missing in 1997 during a night drive home. He was, as writers tend to be, a bit quirky, a bit creative, a bit unusual and witty, and he was working on a script late into the night at his office in Santa Fe. And once he was done for the night, he headed home to Santa Barbara, which was like a 14-hour drive, which is just bonkers. But apparently he liked the change of environment. He liked having his office away from his home, away from his town, away from his community, somewhere that he could, really get away and focus on the writing, which, I mean, is understandable. But his wife was waiting in Santa Barbara for him to return, and when he didn't, she called him. He said he was still on his way, but didn't really give an exact location, and this is the last time that he was ever heard from. Searches were done. Nothing was found. But a year later, both Gary and his vehicle were found, submerged below a bridge in Palmdale, California. When police pulled the car out of the water, they found that Gary's laptop was missing, which contained on it the script that he was writing, and his personal firearm was missing. And I think most strangely of all, both of his hands were also missing. Now, what's strange about this? Well, there are a few things that are strange about this. But firstly, the car's headlights weren't turned on, like they weren't set to the on switch, which is a bit weird if you're driving at night. Secondly, these waters were actually checked shortly after Gary's disappearance, but back then nothing was found, which is a bit strange. Thirdly, police said that in order for Gary to have driven off this bridge, he would have had to have gotten onto this road and driven for roughly 3 miles in the wrong direction, which would have been against oncoming traffic, but no one had reported seeing Gary or a car doing something like this on the night. And if he had been driving the wrong way and a car, had come towards him and startled him, and then he panicked and swerved off the bridge, which I think is what it looks like, or was made to look like, then surely this other oncoming driver would have witnessed this, would have reported something like this. And fourthly, obviously, he had no hands, which I don't know how that even happens. This is as far as the investigation went, and whether it was just a sheer unlucky accident or maybe some sort of targeted hit, we, at least currently, don't really know. The geezer bandit is a bit of a strange one. So the term geezer is British slang for a man, but more often a old man. And this bandit or bank robber was known as the geezer bandit because, I mean, look at him. He's a geezer. He is wanted for committing at least 11 bank robberies, but possibly up to 16, in California between 2009 and 2011. He is thought to be around 60 to 70 years old, around 6 feet tall, and his MO was to walk into the bank as normal, go up to the teller as normal, and give them a note saying something to the effect of, "Give me $50,000 or I will murder you," which is not normal. He is, or at least was, on the FBI's top 10 list and had a $20,000 reward set for anyone with any information leading to his arrest. And there were actually some theories that the geezer bandit was actually a younger man wearing a fake rubber plastic mask. This theory originated when video footage of the geezer bandit came out, showing the man move quite sprightly for a man of his age, and so people started to think that maybe it was a younger man wearing a very convincing latex mask, which honestly is certainly a possibility. So a bit of a strange one. He never killed or really hurt people during these robberies, but he is still a wanted and potentially dangerous man. The German headless horse. So this was the remains found of a horse from 1400 years ago, which didn't have a head. It was found in southern Germany in a cemetery and was found next to the remains of a man who did have his head, and he was thought to be the rider or owner of this horse. The deaths and burials of these two happened during the Merovingian dynasty, and the man was thought to be somewhat high up in the king's command at the time, which is all well and good, but just exactly why this horse was buried without a head, or why its head was bloody chopped off prior to it being buried, is still a mystery. It might have been a ritual of some kind or something like that, or maybe the horse just got in an accident, lost its head, and was buried alongside its owner. We really don't know, but either way, poor horse. The ghost gunshot was a case in Switzerland where this man was just walking along, him and his two children, when suddenly he felt a pain in one of his legs. This was a sharp, intense pain. He had no idea where it was coming from or what caused it, and so he immediately went to the emergency room, and they informed him that he had been shot. They found a small projectile in him, so they removed it, treated the wound, and sent him on his way. He never heard the shot, he didn't know where it came from, and obviously wasn't really thinking that at all, as he had to be told by the doctors that he had actually been shot. When police were later investigating this incident, they thought that it might have been a negligent firing of a gun, maybe from someone far away using a weaker rifle, firing at a target, missing, and then the bullet traveling more and more and more, getting slower and less powerful over time, and eventually randomly embedding it into this guy's leg. They said it was low enough of a caliber to not really do too much damage, that it was far away enough so that this guy didn't actually hear the firing of it, and it wasn't thought to be a hit or deliberate attack or anything like that, but rather just sheer negligence. They never did find out who fired it or where it came from, but it is kind of a wild story. So grab a drink. My choice today is Darjeeling tea with milk, and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. Guccifer 2.0. So this is a bit of a strange political entry, I guess. It was the name of this person or group that claimed to be behind the hacking of the DNC. They hacked and leaked a bunch of their sensitive documents in the 2016 presidential election with Trump and Hillary. Guccifer 2.0 is actually different to the original Guccifer, who was a Romanian hacker who hacked various politicians and figureheads sort of thing, and he created his name by combining Gucci with Lucifer, as he said he had the style of Gucci but the light of Lucifer, which is a bit of a strange claim, but don't get 2.0 and the original confused, even though they should have, just used different names. But some people think Guccifer 2.0 is basically a persona created by Russian intelligence, but Russia denies all connection with this hacker, and the hacker themselves says that they are not Russian, but that they are Romanian like the original Guccifer. So we officially still have no idea to this day who Guccifer 2.0 actually is, other than that they're a hacker who seems to enjoy targeting political targets, but that's really about all. Gummy with a Twist is a video, a YouTube video, a scary one, which features the Gummy Bear song in Hungarian that plays for a little bit, and then out of nowhere comes the K-Fee coffee commercial. It was uploaded in 2007, had almost as many dislikes as it had likes, and due to it mainly just scaring kids who happen to like the Gummy Bear song, it was eventually taken down by the creator, and for a period of time it was considered lost media. It has since been found and re-uploaded, so kind of mystery solved, but it is always nice to see people using that jump scare. The Harappan language is a crazy interesting one. This was the language of the Indus Valley civilization, or the Harappan civilization as it is sometimes known, and they were this huge civilization that spanned for like 2,000 years, from roughly 3300 BC to 1300 BC, around the Indus River and modern day Pakistan, India sort of area. The Harappan civilization was thought to be bigger and more widespread than any other civilization at the time. This includes the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, Europeans, the Chinese even, and consisted of an estimated 5 million citizens. It was first discovered, or rediscovered, in the 1800s by a man named Charles Masson. Now, he is an interesting figure in and of himself, but he originally came to this area in India through the East India Company Army at the age of 21. He was there working for 5 years or so before running away and becoming what was known as a deserter. He then traveled around India, various other areas such as Afghanistan, and basically became a Indiana Jones type of character. He would explore ruins, uncover areas, uncover rare coins and artifacts, and was one of the first Europeans, at least, to properly discover some of these areas, languages, and civilizations. He excavated over 50 Buddhist sites over the years and collected as many as 47,000 coins during this time. Then, more than 20 years later, in 1842, he returned to London, settled down, married, had kids, and then died shortly after. Masson chose originally for his explorations of the East a route and sites that closely tied in with the military campaign of Alexander the Great. And from these explorations, he became one of, if not the first European to rediscover the city of Alexandria in the Caucasus, which was an ancient buried city near Bagram that was founded by Alexander the Great during his conquests. And here he found seals, he found coins, he found rings, just all sorts of ancient goodies. And he was also, as we mentioned earlier, the first European to discover the Harappa ruins. He found and made note of the many artifacts that apparently just lay around here, kind of half buried. And this was before the Western world was really getting serious about stuff like archaeology, you know, making an active effort to go out there, explore, translate languages. So this was like just before the boom sort of thing. And also a lot of the local people didn't really care about these sites at all. They just saw them as whatever, these old ruins over the way. They weren't bothered about preserving the sites. In fact, a lot of them were, if not completely, then at least partially dismantled. The local people had simply been, you know, taking the bricks, taking the structures apart in order to build stuff of their own nearby. So they weren't interested about securing or preserving any artifacts, any old ruins or sites, in trying to figure out about these ancient people, in trying to translate one of their ancient languages. I guess they were more like, you know, practical in a way, and the Europeans were more curious, more awe-inspired. So partly because of these two reasons, there was a lot to discover, and not many people out there either willing or able to do it. And one of the things Masson discovered, as we mentioned earlier, was the Harappan language, which we'll get into in just a little bit. But first we need to mention a little bit about the Harappan civilization, which was honestly really quite something. These cities were these huge, well-designed cities with constant trade happening from nearby and faraway nations. And I mean, honestly, just look at these photos. Just imagine for a second being a lone explorer in the 1800s and stumbling upon or seeing these ancient ruins, uncovering coins, artifacts, little inscriptions that you have no idea what they mean, and perhaps clues about who these people worshipped, what their beliefs were, how their societies worked, what technologies they had, what they got up to on a, you know, day-to-day basis. Super cool. There were notably no really giant structures in the cities. You know, no pyramids or ziggurats as you had in Egypt or Mesopotamia. The buildings and homes were all built out and planned on a really well-structured and well-ordered grid pattern, and they all had fantastic drainage and sewage systems, which were honestly the absolute best for their time and were far more advanced than any other civilization at that point in time. The cities had relatively large walls, which likely protected them from invasions and floods, and there were a few larger buildings in the cities, but these were thought most likely to be communal sort of places. So public baths, communal areas, political meeting places, you know, where people in the town could meet up, exchange ideas and technologies, perhaps design the city plans, just really cool stuff. And I fell into a rabbit hole about these people, and I could honestly probably go on a tangent about them all day. They were seemingly super advanced for their time, super fair and egalitarian, had some incredible technologies and architecture, and as we said, a seemingly full language that we to this day, still haven't been able to translate. Perhaps something like the Egyptian Rosetta Stone will turn up, you know, to maybe help us translate from this language into another one that we know a little better, perhaps. And it would be really, really cool to understand this language, as it would give us a greater insight into these people, into their technologies and beliefs and way of life. But until then, we'll just have to settle for these incredible sights and these gorgeous discoveries. Henryk Siwiak. So he was this strange case in that he was the only murdered person in New York on September 11th. And he was actually the last person to die on that date. And he wasn't killed anywhere near the towers. He was actually killed a few neighborhoods over, just before midnight, after heading out to meet someone for a potential job opportunity. So it's late at night and Henryk is preparing to head out for this interview he has with a guy that he doesn't know too much about. So I mean, it's a great start already. He is wearing his favorite camo jacket, his camo pants, his black boots, and carrying a backpack with a change of clothes in them. And before he leaves, he asks his landlady for, you know, kind of directions, advice on how to get there. And she tells him, she asks him, she even begs him not to go out. She said the area that he had planned to go to was kind of a dodgy area, and it was late at night, people were likely on edge from the attacks that happened earlier in the day. But he insisted he would be fine, and so he left to go meet this guy for the interview. He left the house, got off at the subway stop that he was supposed to get off at, and then took a wrong turn, ended up in the wrong neighborhood. And as some of the witnesses said, they heard outside shouting, an argument, and then they heard several gunshots. When the police and ambulance were eventually called, they found Henryk on the street, having been shot once in the lung, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation for this one was a little weak, as you can imagine, the police for the entirety of New York were a little stretched thin on that day. They were dealing with tons of anxious citizens, with the cleanup efforts, with a few instances of looting going on. Like, it was just a high security sort of situation, and a lot of them were standing guard for other potential attacks that might occur on that day. So Henryk's body was taken away, evidence like the shell casings were collected, canvassing was done with door-to-door questioning, but the few witnesses that there were didn't really see much, and they weren't really able to come up with any leads or suspects, and all of this was done, Henry's investigation, with a reduced team size. So the people collecting the evidence, there was less of them than there should have been. The people going door to door, there was less of them. So it seems like Henryk's murder didn't really get as much attention as it should have done. But as I said, the entire city was super packed up at that point, so it's hard to say what is reasonable in this case. His sister thinks that Henryk might have been killed because it was 9/11, people were on edge, and although he was from Poland, Henryk had somewhat of a darker complexion, and he spoke with an accent, he had kind of broken English. He was wearing, combat fatigues with a backpack, black boots, so maybe someone got startled and confused, thought that he was, planning something, and then when communications broke down, shots started to be fired. The killing got very little media attention. No new witnesses have since come forward. No new evidence has been gathered. And some 23 years later, Henryk's murder is still a cold case and still unsolved. The Hessdalen lights. So these are these lights from an unknown source, or sources, that have been appearing in the Hessdalen Valley since the 1930s. They are usually white, yellow, or red, which, that's basically the most regular colors you can think of. But theories for this one range from extraterrestrial activities to regular terrestrial activities, like, cars and headlights and airplanes sort of thing, to illusions, to mirages, to stars, or to spontaneous, combusting, airborne, mining dust particles, which is honestly my favorite theory. They are another interesting example of essentially ghost lights that hopefully we'll solve worldwide sometime soon. The Hodge conjecture. So this is an unsolved math problem, essentially. It is a very complex problem that has $1 million reward for anyone able to either prove or disprove it. And it has obviously not yet been solved. It genuinely hurt my brain trying to learn about this. Just look at all of this. It is bonkers. Let me know in the comment section if you actually understand any of this. But it's basically, if the theory is true, it would allow us to determine far more information about a mathematical shape or dimension or reality than we are currently able to do. Bloody complex one, this, but take a crack at it and maybe you can win the million. The investor boat murders was honestly a horrific case. It took place in Alaska 1982 on a fishing boat, and Mark Coulthurst, his pregnant wife Irene Coulthurst, their 2 children aged 4 and 5, and 4 fishing helpers essentially, all in their late teens, were out on the Investor, which was the name of their fishing boat, when they were all brutally murdered. It's kind of hard to describe this, so just try and imagine the scene. They're out on the waters fishing throughout the day. They eventually get back to the dock, and they don't tie up directly to the dock, as either it's a hassle or the dock is full, so they kind of daisy chain their boat to another boat, which is in turn daisy chained to another one. So you've got the dock, you've got one boat tied to it, another boat tied next to that, and then you have the Investor tied at the end. So this is where they stayed for the night. But that is all to say that if anyone wanted to get onto the Investor from, the dock, from land, they would need to first cross over these other 2 boats and potentially, risk running into these other crews before they got to the Investor. So that's what happened. They all tied up, they went to bed for the night, all of these 8 people, and then in the middle of the night, someone snuck onto the boat, past these other 2 boats, past these crews, and it is thought shot and killed all 8 people. And the other boats at the time were celebrating, they were having a party, and so with everyone drinking, with everyone, passed out, loud music playing earlier, it is reasonable to think that nobody might have heard or seen him. It is just rather strange though. The next morning, the crew members from these other boats, woke up, they were hungover, and they saw the Investor kind of drifting away, disconnected, and they worried for a little bit until they saw, a guy come up, say, "Hey, how you doing? Everything's fine," sort of thing. They assumed, it was one of the workers, and so they didn't really worry. The boat then was driven away, but little did they know at this point in time, they were looking at the guy who had just killed all 8 people aboard. The guy took the ship, drove it away to somewhere else, tried to actually sink it, got off board, but he then returned to the boat hours later, and the boat was still floating just fine. So he ended up filling it up with gasoline and setting the entire thing alight. Someone from another boat quickly saw the smoke, came over, and they actually saw the murderer, near the boat, and he was apparently super chill. He said, we're just burning the boat, or it was an accident or something. There's no one on board, everyone is off safe. And he kind of hung around for some reason and chatted and mingled with the guy. And the authorities actually instructed no one to try and put the boat out, as they deemed it to be too dangerous. So they just left it there, they let it burn, they let it do their thing. And eventually, when they investigated the boat, they found the remains of all 8 people. Mark and Irene were shot dead. The others were likely thought to have been shot dead, but they couldn't really tell because the fires had too badly damaged their bodies. The suspect, who was described as a white male of medium build in his early 20s, was thought to have left the scene, drove out of town, and was never seen again. And even though multiple people had spotted this guy, they didn't really have any immediate suspects. Basically, all of the evidence was burnt up during the fire, and, trying to search America for a white guy of medium build in his 20s, that narrows it down a lot. So the investigation kind of went on and on slowly, and 2 years later, the police arrested a man named John Peel. He had worked for Mark in the past and even dated his sister, and he had somewhat a similar appearance to the suspect. He said, as most reasonable people would, that he was asleep at the time of the murders, but police obviously didn't believe him, as they brought him in, they arrested him, and they charged him for these 8 murders. He had 2 trials in the end, with the second one finding him not guilty. And on top of being found not guilty, he actually sued the state for wrongful prosecution. And he won, being awarded $900,000. And that was, believe it or not, basically the end of the case. Police firmly believed that John Peel committed these murders, but he was found not guilty by a jury of his peers, and so he couldn't be charged again for these murders. And because they believe so firmly that it was John, they have basically closed the case and are not really pursuing any extra evidence or the investigation. They believe they caught their guy, but the justice system basically failed them, which is a little ironic. But then there's the question of why exactly John would do something like this. office, when he seemed to know Mark and his family quite well. He didn't really have any bad blood with them, and he didn't have any criminal history or violent past. So it seems a little strange, and probably more likely, in my opinion, that it was just someone else. But that's where the case currently sits. James Spollen. So this one is like straight out of a murder mystery novel or something. It's 1856, and a man is found dead, murdered in his office, which was locked from the inside. Yeah, I'm surprised he wasn't killed with a candlestick as well. But this really was quite a brutal case. This was in Dublin, and at the time, there hadn't been one conviction of murder for the past 15 years, which made this case at the time especially horrific and startling. George Little's throat had been cut and his head bashed in, and he was found lying face down on his office floor in the Dublin Broadstone train station. In the office at the time was tons and tons of cash, which were the takings from the train station for the week, and not all of it was taken, only some of it, which is already a tiny bit strange. You know, if you're gonna go through and murder someone, at least take a bag and take as much cash as you can. But after doing the accounts, it seems like only £330 was taken, which was obviously worth a lot more at that time. But my point is, they could have taken more. It was a very busy week at the station, lots and lots of cash was collected, and the entire investigation was honestly, even from the start, kind of a complete failure. The start of the investigation was delayed by like a day and a half. The crime scene wasn't secured properly. You know, people were in and out of the office contaminating evidence. Some of the important evidence wasn't collected, and it was all really just a mess. Eventually, they drained the nearby canal and found a cutthroat razor and a hammer, which were very likely the murder weapons. They interviewed several people who worked at the station, several people who might have been nearby, but it seems like there weren't too many, as George was actually working late that night, and so a lot of his regular colleagues would have, gone home already. But it was even more and more like a murder mystery novel, because there were like little bits of evidence which pointed to like almost everyone they interviewed. Everyone was acting a little bit sus. A bunch of people lied about where they were at what times, and so it was very confusing because it was like everyone they interviewed seemed to be up to something. It was likely they all didn't murder the guy, but it was made an even more confusing case because of this. A few suspects were brought in, but were all eventually acquitted. Police didn't really have any more suspects or things to go on. That is, until a woman turned in her husband and said that he was responsible for the murder, and she had helped him hide the cash that he stole. And this man was none other than James Spollen, who was just a random guy. He was working in the train station, and I guess either he did commit the murder or his wife just really didn't like him or something. So the police arrested him, they charged him with murder, but he too was eventually acquitted. And so at this point, they basically had no one. Maybe if they had sealed off the crime scene and actually had some evidence, but what do I know? And this is when a man with a very interesting theory came along called Frederick Bridges. He was a big pusher and believer in something called phrenology, which is a now debunked science that basically said you could tell a lot about someone's personality by the shape of their brain. So like if this part of the brain was responsible for like aggression, then you'd expect this part of the brain or skull to be more pronounced in a potentially aggressive person. And that was basically the theory. So after Spollen was acquitted, Bridges met up with him and offered him a bunch of cash to measure his skull and to get a plaster cast from it. To which Spollen said, "Heck yes, plaster me up and give me cash." So Bridges had this particular idea that was completely scientific and based on evidence. He said that a regular, sane, normal human being had no more than 25 degrees between their eyebrow and their ear. So like that would be completely reasonable. But a psychopath apparently had, 35 degrees or even 45 degrees between the eyebrow and the ear. Crazy, right? Like, no, it literally sounds like crazy talk. But Bridges measured Spollen and then contacted authorities in Dublin and said, "Look, I know you already arrested him, tried him, and acquitted him for these crimes, but I measured his head in plaster and he is definitely a violent psychopath. So can you please arrest him?" Like, I'm not even making this up. This is exactly what happened. Bridges never received a reply, which I think is just as well, but this dude had some wild beliefs and faith in phrenology, where he genuinely believed not only could this help law enforcement, so, you know, if you've got a bunch of suspects, do, you know, the skull test sort of thing, find out which one is the violent criminal, and he's obviously the guilty one, but he believed that regular citizens should have their skull shape and size measured on a regular basis, and if they were found to have a, you know, psychopath-shaped head, apparently, that they should be immediately locked up to prevent them committing the violent crimes that they are obviously going to commit because of the shape of their head, which is some seriously unhinged stuff. So yeah, it's no wonder he didn't get a response back. Spolin took the money that he was paid, got on a boat to America, and started a new life over there, but Dublin never did find out who murdered George Little. Jeffrey Gebhardt was an awfully strange case where in 2012 Georgia, Jeffrey went out hunting with a hunting buddy of his, and the two ended up getting separated. They eventually found their way back to each other by evening time, but the next day the two went out hunting again in the same area and once again lost each other. So at 10 p.m. that night, after being separated for many hours, Jeffrey's friend wasn't able to get in touch with Jeffrey, and so he called 911 to report Jeffrey missing. But he found out from them that Jeffrey had actually been in contact with the local police. As he had called them, he said he was lost and needed help, but his calls kept dropping out due to a lack of signal. And so after he was reported missing, the police went out to search for Henry in the last place that his phone had pinged at, and they eventually found him, dead on the floor with 17 stab wounds, 3 of which were directly to the heart. There lay beside him 2 knives, or rather one beside him, one underneath him, but no witnesses, no suspects, and strangely enough, only 1 set of footprints in the mud, which were Jeffrey's. So was he brutally, carefully murdered here, you know, out in the wilderness where there were no witnesses, no one to see it? Or was he attacked perhaps by an animal, which seems unlikely to me, just because of the nature of the attacks and the fact that there were, you know, knives around. It seems very likely that the knives were the weapon here. And since you don't see deer too often picking up knives and using them, it was very likely a human suspect. Now, whether this suspect was someone else committing a murder, or whether it was Jeffrey himself committing you know what, that is basically the main question in this case. And I know what you're thinking, because I thought exactly the same thing. You know, lost in the woods at night, 17 stab wounds, 3 of which were to the heart. There's no way that Jeffrey could have done this to himself. And the jury is honestly kind of out on that one. It is thought at least possible that Jeffrey could have done something like this to himself, you know, as long as he acted quickly before passing out or bleeding out. And there were only Jeffrey's knives found at the scene, only Jeffrey's blood, only Jeffrey's footprints, so, you know, it doesn't really look good. And I think the mystery in this one comes from the contrasting evidence and scene, where you have the weapons, the footprints, the scenario, all kind of pointing to it being Jeffrey, but the wounds and the sheer nature of the attack point to it being an attack by someone else. So a very tragic and brutal case, no matter which way you look at it. Also a very confusing case, and one that has not been solved in the past 12 years. Kryptos is a cryptic sculpture that is on display at the George Bush Center for Intelligence in Virginia. It is a pretty cool sculpture made from copper, petrified wood, stone, plants, and a few other things. But the most important part are these copper sheets. And these sheets contain encrypted messages, 3 of which have been solved, with the 4th one remaining for the past 34 years unsolved. They all use different encryption techniques and methods, and the creator of both the puzzles and the sculptures has over the years given out, you know, little clues, translated a word or two for us every few years or so to try and, you know, help us along with figuring it out, and still no one has figured out the entire thing. It is, however, looking more and more likely every year that we eventually will figure it out, and he has apparently arranged things where upon his death the solution to this puzzle will be released, which is always nice. But I guess then we will have to replace this sculpture with another cryptic puzzle, and I think this should be an ongoing trend and tradition where there's like constantly a puzzle sculpture there, and every time it's solved it just maybe gets moved to a different part and replaced with with a brand new cryptic sculpture. Lots of fun for all the family, and it does look pretty cool. So grab a drink, my choice today is chai, and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg, the Lady of the Dune. So this was an unidentified lady found dead in 1974 in Massachusetts. Well, she was unidentified until 2022, and after doing years of testing on the remains and evidence and doing many investigations, she was officially identified as Ruth Marie Terry. And she was married to a guy, like literally his name was Guy Moldavan, and he wasn't what you'd call the perfect husband. The two got married in February of 1974, and friends and family always used to say that Ruth wasn't really herself when she was around Guy. She always seemed a little scared, like she was walking on eggshells sort of thing, and apparently Guy was also very controlling and possessive. Then in the summer of 1974, just months after they got married, Guy went to Ruth's family in Tennessee and told them that Ruth had just gone missing, just left their home in California, and Guy had no idea where she went, which sounds suspicious. Ruth's brother actually ended up hiring a private investigator to, try to get to the bottom of where Ruth went, if in fact she did actually go anywhere. And the private investigator came to the conclusion that Ruth had just sold all of her stuff and left the state. And he said, from the evidence he gathered, that she probably did it on her own, and that was basically it. So nobody knew where she had gone to, where she was, and when the Lady of the Dunes was found that very same year, nobody really connected the two. The Lady of the Dunes was found in Massachusetts, and Ruth was living in California at the time. So yeah, as I said, it took until 2022 until the two were finally connected. Now, I guess the big obvious question is whether Ruth actually did run away, and maybe was hitchhiking and then whatever happened to her happened on the road, or whether she was killed first and then this whole her running away was used by someone to cover up the crime. So the first obvious suspect, as it always is, was her husband Guy, and he was a really dodgy sort of fella. He did die in 2002, so by the time the body was found of Ruth, he was, long dead, so he wasn't able to be charged or investigated at all. But Guy himself had a fairly long rap sheet. In 1958, so 16 years before he married Ruth, Guy was married to a woman called Manzanita Eileen Ryan. And just a year and a half after getting married, Manzanita and her 18-year-old daughter both went missing. Guy was obviously investigated and seen as a prime suspect for this, but when police brought him in for questioning, he basically went on the run, which again is a little suspicious. Some would even say a lottle suspicious. He was eventually arrested and captured in Seattle, and so they brought him in, they questioned him, but he was never charged for anything. Even though, and I am not kidding, even though they found dismembered body parts inside of his septic tank. And because they were in the septic tank, there was no way for the police to find out who the body parts belonged to. Guy just denied all knowledge of the body parts, like he had no idea how they got in there, and so he was never charged for any of it, which is absolutely wild. Then, like 4 months after this, he married another woman called Evelyn Emerson, and just a year after this second marriage, he was charged with scamming Evelyn's family out of like $10,000, and for this, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. So scamming a few grand gets you 15 years in prison, and having literal dismembered human body parts in your septic tank gets you just nothing at all. This is a crazy world. But he basically ended up not serving any jail time, as the judge was just like, look, if you pay the money back, then, you don't need to serve anything. So that's what he did. He was also considered to be the main suspect for the murder of a 28-year-old truck driver and his 17-year-old girlfriend, who in 1950 were both killed while out on a date. Henry, the 28-year-old truck driver, was shot dead, and his girlfriend's clothes were folded neatly at the scene, but she herself was never seen again. So it's thought likely that whoever killed Henry kidnapped and then later likely killed Barbara. And as I said, he died in 2002, a free man. He was officially named as Ruth's killer in 2023, and yeah, it's insane to think that he got away with what he got away with for as long as he did, but I mean, at least eventually he was actually charged for something, even though it is after his death. Just a horrific guy and some very tragic cases. Lunar swirls. So these are these mysterious light and dark swirls that seem to appear on the surface of the moon from time to time. They are honestly super cool and are thought to be caused by these magnetic rocks on the moon that generate these small magnetic fields and interact with the oncoming solar winds. Kind of similar to our northern lights, except just a little less flashy, I guess, and from a different perspective. Malakia Logan was an 8-year-old girl who went missing in South Carolina in 1988. She was out playing with her sister at a nearby park when she decided she was done for the evening, got on her bike, went to ride home at about 8 o'clock, and although her home was just minutes away, she never made it. Nobody saw her after she left the park, and it wasn't until 2 years later, after dozens of searches and investigations and interviews, that some human remains were found of a young girl. And although they tried to get DNA evidence off these remains, it wasn't actually until 8 years after the remains were found that they were able to do so. And to basically no one's surprise, when the results came back, they tested as a match for Malakia. Now, as far as suspects go, there was only really one major one in this case, and that was around the time and location of the disappearance, around this park that Malakia was playing in. Witnesses said they saw a white, blonde-haired man just kind of hovering around the area, and by the time Malakia was gone, he was also gone. So he was naturally a primary suspect, but he was never located or identified. Now, another major suspect in this case was a man named Charles Hampton, and he was a suspect before Malakia's body was even found or identified. At the time, he was in prison for a peeping Tom charge, in that he was found drilling holes through the wall of a woman's bathroom and, spying on them through them. So he was, being prosecuted for this crime. And in 2002, he actually confessed to murdering Malakia and to doing other despicable things to her, which I won't get into because that is disturbing. But he confessed to all of this, and he also confessed to a bunch of other assaults and killings and kidnappings, and he allowed the police to take his DNA, his blood, and he was super enthusiastic about it. It was just really creepy, his attitude. He was getting excited by the whole thing. They searched his home and found girls' underwear in his wash. There was photos of girls in his house in bikinis and underwear. There were naked photos of himself just propped up and hanging around the house. This guy was a massive creep. He even had naked photos of his ex-wife just chilling. So the police were yep, we got the evidence. He's a massive creep. He's confessed to all of this. Easy case. But soon after this, he stopped cooperating with the police. He recanted all of his confessions. And then the police realized we haven't actually really got any evidence on him outside of, some creepy photos that weren't technically illegal and some confessions that he's now recanted. So, we can't use them. So we're kind of in trouble here. Charles had 5 years left on his sentence for the peeping Tom charge. So that was basically the time frame, how long the police roughly had left in order to further investigate, gather evidence, gather other things, and to build a substantial case against Charles so that when he got out of prison, they were able to, not let him go free after he came out for these charges. So they worked away at all that, they built up a case, and when he was eventually released from prison, he was immediately put back into custody. And he was charged with all of these crimes just before all of the charges were dropped. It was at the time a shocking announcement, but police basically said even though they were gonna charge him, they felt like they didn't quite have enough evidence to actually make a conviction stick. And so due to double jeopardy, they didn't want to try to convict him, have him be found innocent, and then later on when they found more evidence, not be able to convict him, which I can't fully blame them with that logic. If they genuinely thought they weren't going to get a conviction, it might make sense to hold out on it just a little bit longer in hopes of finding something more solid. And so even though the police thought, maybe even felt like they knew George killed Malakia, they weren't really able to press charges and get a conviction. So officially, Malakia's murder is still unsolved, and the killer is likely still out there roaming around. But rest in peace, Malakia. The Mantell UFO incident. So this was a quite interesting UFO account that actually rabbit holes down wildly and deeply into this crazy story and string of events. So this whole thing started in 1948 when this flying object that couldn't be identified was spotted by the Kentucky Air National Guard. They had no idea what it was, so they sent out 4 fighter planes to, go and investigate it. And they all went out chasing this thing until one by one they slowly, dropped off, came back sort of thing, except for Captain Thomas Mantell. He was chasing it, flying higher and higher and higher into the sky, and the planes that they were flying really weren't built for this level of altitude. Thomas was asked, advised to, give up chase, come back to base sort of thing, but against his and apparently everyone else's better judgment, he kept chasing this UFO farther and farther, higher and higher, until at about 25,000 feet, Thomas passed out. There was simply not enough oxygen at this level of altitude, and with him passed out, the plane then went into a death spiral and eventually just came crashing down into a field in Kentucky. Captain Mantell was obviously dead from the crash, but soon rumors about what this UFO actually was naturally started to pop up and spread around. And these rumors were, well, they ranged from quite reasonable to really quite wild. Maybe it was a Soviet missile or a secret Soviet flying craft that was faster, more powerful, and more maneuverable than anything we had ever seen before. Or perhaps it was a genuine alien spaceship that, after being pursued by Captain Mantell, felt that maybe he was getting too close, so they attacked the plane and shot him down. There were other rumors and theories about the details of the case that said it was basically a cover-up and Mantell didn't die from the crash, but that when they found his body it was like riddled with bullet wounds, or that there was no plane to be found, as if Mantell and his plane had just, vanished in midair, interdimensional portal sort of thing, or from some secret weapon that just completely obliterated them. And yeah, as I said, a lot of theories. But the explanation that the government originally gave, if you believe them, was that Venus, the planet, was actually the UFO. Yeah, they said that Mantell mistook Venus in the sky for UFO, and so was chasing it, trying to get closer, and, eventually went up that high. And since you can't reach Venus in a World War II plane, no matter how much gusto you may have, he eventually crashed. Then they changed their story and were like, okay, that sounds ridiculous. That's probably not what happened, but let us tell you what did actually happen. We have these, weather balloons that we send up into the sky to detect changes in temperature and help predict weather patterns. And that is probably what he saw when he was chasing it. Then they later said, okay, that wasn't it. And it's like, goddamn, make up your mind. But they said, actually, back when this happened, we had this top secret military invention called the Skyhook balloon, which was much bigger than a weather balloon at the time and was apparently used in a few top secret spy missions against the USSR, where these balloons would take various things up into the atmosphere, like for instance microphones, and they would just hover up there in the atmosphere and listen out for mostly USSR nuclear tests. And as I said, these balloons were top secret at the time. They didn't want news getting out about them. They didn't want the Russians finding out about them. And so that's why they were being, super secretive about it. But this secrecy led to people developing theories, people thinking it was an alien craft. And yeah, but bear in mind, this is just the official, statement. I'm not necessarily advocating for this or saying this is how it happened, but this is basically what the government said happened. And people have said that this is also the reason for the Roswell incident, in that, in 1947, this was still a top secret piece of technology. And after one of them went up, eventually crashed down, the government had to be super secretive about this, to protect the invention, protect it from any leaks, so that the Soviets didn't get clue of, what was happening, what they had invented. And so because of all of this secrecy, people thought it was a alien spaceship that crashed. But that's if you believe their version of events, which of course that's maybe what they'd like you to believe if, an alien spacecraft did actually land there. And that could very well be the case. So yeah, as I said, you can go down this rabbit hole for days if you wanted to. It does go incredibly deep into government missions and a bunch of technology that was invented in those days, and, you know, secret spy mission sort of thing. And officially, this event is, you know, explained away, but if you don't believe the official theory, then it is still one of the most tragic, unsolved UFO incidents. Matt and Wendy Jameson's money. So this was a fairly short mystery that involved Mr. and Mrs. Jameson and a bunch of cash. So it was 1995 in Fair Oaks, California, and the Jamesons had just got home from church at around 10:30 in the morning. And after coming home, they discovered tons of notes. Well, not actually tons, but like a lot of notes just seemingly thrown over into their back garden. They were all $20 US dollar notes, and they obviously ran over, picked them all up, collected them all. They noticed a few more over the fences of like their neighbors, but they didn't collect those ones. They just assumed that their neighbors had, you know, come home earlier and collected the ones that were in their garden. And after collecting all of them, they decided that it was probably a good idea to go to the police with this, you know, to ask what their options were, sort of thing. And the police told them to put an advert in the local paper, and if no one came to collect it after 90 days, then they were free legally to keep the money. And they posted the advert. Nobody came to collect it, and so the Jamesons legally got to keep the $6.5 grand that they found. Theories for where it might have come from range from dropping out of an airplane for some reason to someone dumping some dirty money, but still, it is very strange, and to this day, nobody knows where that money came from. The mind-body problem is an interesting, long-discussed philosophical problem of just exactly how the mind and body are connected. Now, there are a ton of questions and points to make on this one, so I won't really have the time or the mental energy to go through all of them, but some basic questions are, for example, just like, how are the mind and body connected? Do they work on two separate systems and they're feeding information between them? Are they just like two parts of the same overall system, like the fingers on your hand, for example? And which of them has more control, if you can even word it that way, or a greater effect over the other one? Like, there's always the age-old joke or question about whether the brain was developed by the body, you know, as like a tool to think and go out there and grab food and bring it to the body, or whether the body was developed by the brain, as, you know, the brain needs sustenance, so it develops its body to go out there and physically grab things for it. And I know that's not really how biology works, but it's like an interesting perspective. Like, for example, it's quite well known that your mind can affect your body. So stuff like positive situations, positive affirmations can have a quite positive physical effect on your body. Negative mental stuff like stress can definitely have a negative effect on your body, causing all of these physical health problems, etc. Then there's, of course, the other way, where a physical activity like exercise can actually improve your mental state, and stuff like crying can actually release some things within you and make you feel better mentally. So there is definitely that two-way connection. So it's not really a crime or cryptidy entry, this one. It's more a mystery about we don't really know that much about the mind yet, and it is a wild topic to learn about. The monster of Udine was a serial killer who killed at least 4 women in Italy in the 1970s and 80s. There wasn't too much to go off for this one, but the victims were all linked to one another due to being cut with likely a scalpel all along their stomach area, almost like a C-section. And because of this strangely specific wound on all 4 women, the police suspected that maybe they were dealing with a doctor or a medical professional. But aside from this, police never really made a breakthrough on the case, and so there were never really any major suspects for these killings. As well as these 4 victims that were all thought likely to be from this killer, there were also 12 more victims kind of in and around the area, in and around this period of time, that were thought might be connected to the monster of Udine, but they were killed in various different ways, and so the connection wasn't as airtight as these other 4 women. Still a messed up case though, and since no one was caught for it, the killer is very likely still out there roaming around, free to do as he pleases, which is a terrifying thought. The Mothman is one of the more well-known cryptids in this day and age, and the initial rumors and sightings of its existence originated in West Virginia. And I just love this title, which was the title of the first ever article posted about the Mothman. This was in 1966, and it read, "Couples see man-sized bird create something. Like, literally just that. Which makes it sound like I wrote the article. But anyway, it is described as a creature between 7 feet and 10 feet tall, with red glowing eyes, huge wings, and a threatening demeanor. So, I mean, it was all fine up until a threatening demeanor, which again is a very strange description of it. It was seen a few more times after the initial sightings, and theories for what it might have been range from, of course, aliens, come down from God knows where to hunt and torment humans, to a demon, which is a fine guess, I guess. You know, red eyes, shifty, wings, threatening demeanor, definitely all signs of demon. Then there's the theory that it is a misidentified crane or heron, and while these birds aren't typically seen in the area that the Mothman was seen in, some people think it might be possible that they, you know, got rerouted, got lost, and I mean, it's not completely out of the question for these birds to have been there. The birds are quite tall, they have pretty decent wingspans, and a few of them have this red coloring around their eyes, which, you know, might have reflected light and looked like red eyes. But then there's sightings where the Mothman literally hunts people, chases them in their car, even landing on top of their car and attacking their roof, which I don't think a heron would do, but I'm not a zoologist, so maybe I have no idea. There is a yearly Mothman festival held in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which is where the Mothman was originally spotted, and this festival brings in more than 10,000 people every year. There's a huge 12-foot tall statue of the Mothman, and everyone seems to have a grand old time. So a terrifying creature that might very well still be out there. The Myojo 56 building fire. So this was an absolutely devastating building fire that took place in Tokyo on September the 1st, 2001. It began at around 1 in the morning, and for the next 5 hours, almost the entire building would be caught up in flames. Now, the building itself had numerous safety problems and violations that made this go from a unfortunate fire that killed a few people to an absolutely devastating death trap that ended up killing 44 people. And one of the major problems in this building was that a bunch of the stairwells were kind of blocked out with stuff, and the fire doors were held open. So because the stairs were blocked, it was very difficult for people to, you know, leave the building. And since the fire doors were all open and were very difficult to close, the fire spread very quickly. The smoke engulfed the entire building, as did lethal levels of carbon monoxide. There were quite a few arrests that took place in regards to this fire, but they were basically just all for the building owners and the building managers for, you know, maintaining bad safety standards, not for actually starting the fire. The Tokyo police did eventually come to the conclusion that the fire was started deliberately, and someone was to blame for all of these deaths, but they could just never get that far in the investigation. It was suspected that the owners of the building might have been connected in some way to either the Chinese or Japanese mafia, due to some rumors of, you know, some illegal stuff taking place, some illegal gambling games happening in the building. And so maybe if they didn't pay up what they owed, then, you know, a fire was started. But that's all, at least for now, just a rumor and theory, I guess, as the investigation never did find out who actually started it. When the fire happened, it made pretty big headlines, especially in Japan, but that was all basically overshadowed by the larger attacks that happened in, obviously, New York on September 11th. The nebula hypothesis was first developed in 1734, and it was first proposed with an actual theory in 1755, and this theory is basically what we use as the current understanding for ours and basically every solar system. It posits that stars like our sun are formed from these huge balls of gas that, you know, slowly clump together over many years, and then when this gas comes together and forms the star, there are these accretion disks that just get blown outwards, and these disks end up, you know, rotating around the star, and the matter in those disks ends up slowly clumping together and forming planets. If you want a deeper exploration into this one, I go quite deep into it on my Space Iceberg, and it is some incredibly fun and fascinating stuff. And while this theory does explain a bunch and is incredibly useful, there are still a few basically unsolved things about the theory and about the entire process. For example, why angular momentum is lost on some things that shoot out from the star. We don't really know why or how that happens. We know for the most part how and why medium chunks clump together into larger chunks and then eventually into planets, but we're not really sure on the early stages on how these tiny particles that are shot out end up clumping together and, becoming medium-sized chunks. Also, why some stars have planets and some don't. Some have dust belts around them, some don't. So yeah, as I said, a very useful theory, but one that doesn't explain everything, and the stuff that's not explained is basically a mystery to us. At least for now. Science is definitely getting there. New England's Dark Day was a very dark day in New England. This was a literally dark day in 1780, and over this general area at around noon, it got so dark that everyone needed to, turn on their lights. Except it was 1780, so they realized, wait, we haven't invented electricity yet, so everyone just had to turn on their candles. This darkness lasted for basically the next day and a half, and we still have no real idea of what caused it. Some say it was smoke from forest fires that, clouded the sky and blocked out the sun, which is a fine theory. Some say it was religious, so God darkening the world for whatever reason, maybe due to sins. But it was a strange few days nonetheless. The Oh My God particle is a pretty cool name, but it was a super high energy ray that was detected in Utah coming from space to the Earth in 1991. This ray was insanely high energy, roughly this many times greater than a standard photon or light particle, and we have witnessed a few cosmic rays that have been similar since this, but this was and still is the most powerful one we have ever detected. We have no idea where it came from, what exactly it is, and if any sentient life did actually send it. And if they did send it, we have no idea why. Planet 9 is this hypothetical planet, not Pluto by the way, but another planet, a ninth planet, that is thought to be perhaps orbiting the sun, but way out, like way out. I mean, look at this image. That's the sun over there, and that little ring, that's the orbit of Neptune, also known as the farthest planet from the sun, at least in our solar system. And obviously, as a disclaimer, this is not an actual photograph, as iPhones have never gone out that far, but this is like an artist's impression or imagination of what it might look like and how far out it would actually be. And for a quick reminder, this is how far out Neptune is compared to, the sun and compared to all the other planets, and this is how far out you'd need to zoom in order to fit in the ninth planet. It would be roughly 250 times farther away from the sun than the Earth is, which is very far, and it would take roughly 10 to 20,000 years to complete one orbit. It was basically originally hypothesized to exist just due to some gravitational effects that have been observed this far out, so they thought, actually, it makes sense for something like a planet to be out there. That would seemingly have the effect that we're observing. So it's still kind of a hypothesis at this point, and it's unknown whether this planet actually does exist or not. But if it doesn't exist, then there is seemingly still something out there causing these gravitational anomalies, so that would just become the new mystery. Space. The pygmy tunnels of Monte Alban. So this is a wildly fascinating one, and Monte Alban was the name for the capital city of the Zapotecs in what is now southwest Mexico. They existed from roughly 200 BC up until like the 1500s when the Spanish arrived, and we don't actually know what the early people called their city, because this was like before the earliest records of writing that we can find in the area. So they were a super old and interesting civilization that had some honestly amazing architecture, and it was similar in ways to some of their neighbors like the Olmecs and the Mayans. They seemed to quite like numbers and calendars, and they were super well connected with nature, with a lot of them believing that they were descended from trees, from rocks, from certain wild animals. So as I said, super fascinating civilization all around, but this entry is regarding some of their architecture, or rather some of these underground tunnels that was found underneath the city, and the exact purpose for them is still to this day unknown. So when the Spanish arrived in like the 1500s, they explored, shall we say, some of these cities, and they got along really well with the local people. That was a joke, by the way. And the story is a little loose, as we often have like accounts of other people, and it's a little mixed up. But one account described visiting the city in like the 1600s, and by this point the original inhabitants of the city had, you know, been killed or moved away or something for hundreds of years at this point. And some of the locals had kind of moved into this abandoned city. They were using some of the underground temples and stuff as like churches or ritual sites. And so the Spanish kind of went exploring, and they found among the ruins of this city this huge underground temple with like these 4 massive connected underground chambers. And these chambers, they said, had been used mostly to bury important people. So in one they would bury like their kings and leaders, in another they would bury their like priests or important religious figures, etc. But one of these led to this deep, dark, underground, gruesome cavern that was full of like the smell of death and decay. It had a bunch of poisonous animals in. So the Spanish were like, yeah, fuck that, and they just sealed up that whole area of it and basically buried the entire thing. And then to cleanse the area of what they thought was like an attack from hell, they built a church on top of it, which is now today the Church of San Pablo. So that just on its own is pretty cool. But later on in modern times, explorers and archaeologists went to, you know, dig and explore beneath this city, and they went like all out on this. They used ground penetrating radar to try and see any secret passages or underground temples or little pockets down there. They used radars, pulses, just all sorts. And while exploring, as well as a bunch of underground chambers, they found these little tunnels, which were about like yay big by also yay big. So like pretty narrow tunnels that were kind of hard to get through. The excavators were barely able to squeeze through them. They had to lie on their back and kind of shuffle along, which sounds absolutely terrifying. So they shuffled along like this for around 200 feet until they got to this tiny room with a skeleton in, and found stuff like incense burners, a bunch of ornaments made out of stone and precious gems. And so they kept making their way through this tunnel and eventually discovered smaller tunnels with little staircases and stuff. And a bunch of these tunnels were either caved in or blocked off purposefully with stuff like clay, or they were even smaller, being like, you know, this big, like just ridiculous sizes. And so they had to use other methods to try and explore them and try and track them. They ended up pumping a ton of smoke through these tunnels to see, you know, where it went and where it came out. And they found that it came out in a bunch of like really far off, strange places. So it seems like there's this whole underground ventilation tunnel system down there. But for what exactly? Using it for air or breathing or smoke is kind of useless. Like, it doesn't really seem to serve a purpose. It wouldn't really be that useful as something like ventilation. It's not thought that you could use it for something like a sewage system or a water tunnel or something. They seem to be like little tunnels for escape. You know, if the city is attacked, you can go through these secret underground tunnels and exit out at some faraway point, nice and safe. The only problem is just how tiny these tunnels were. Like, you wouldn't be able to fit a fully grown human in them, probably not even a child, leaving some people to believe that there were these small pygmy race of people that at one point lived in this place. Whether they were the sole occupants of here, whether they lived alongside humans, or whether the tunnels are not used for this and were used for an entirely different purpose, we to this day don't know. The ruins are still super cool though, and it is definitely on my list of places to visit. The rare earth hypothesis. So this is basically an exploration of a deeper question, that being, are we alone in the universe? The standard, mundane, cosmological belief is that Earth isn't really rare, in that there are likely thousands, millions probably, maybe way more than millions, of planets exactly like Earth, or at least similar enough, that are able to sustain life. life. But we haven't yet discovered them because, as we all know, space is a very large place. So millions of planets like Earth, a bunch of those being probably more than able to support life, which means that the universe is likely just teeming with life. You know, we haven't seen any so far because we've been here only for a relatively short period of time. Maybe they're not as advanced as us. And of course, the universe is absolutely huge. So if there was, you know, super advanced life over here and we are over here, we may very likely, I think, not be able to detect them. But the rare Earth hypothesis says exactly the opposite. That for our sun to be in this particular spot in the galaxy, that's incredibly rare. And for it to contain the exact matter necessary for something like Earth to develop, and for Earth to be, you know, the perfect distance from the sun in order to create and sustain life, and for us to have a moon which helps with tides, like all of these things are basically, the theory says, a statistical impossibility. So the fact that one of these exists is like crazy enough. The odds of another Earth happening similar to ours, and for life to develop and for it to be sustained, etc., is basically statistically impossible, at least as far as this theory says. So it says that all of this is so insanely rare that maybe at most we'll have a few other similar Earths around the universe and a few other occurrences of life, but nowhere near as much as the regular model says. And because the universe is so huge, it says that it is basically an impossibility that we will ever meet another life form. So some crazy stuff and a pretty interesting question, but let me know your thoughts on this one. Richard Patrone and Danielle Imbo were an American couple who went missing in Philadelphia in 2005. They were out for drinks with another couple, kind of like a double date, I suppose. And at around midnight, they left the bar, walked over towards their car, and then were never seen again. This was the last time they were seen, it was the last time their car was ever seen, and their bank records, their phone records all show zero activity from the day they left. Now, I think for this one, it's kind of natural to think that they maybe ran away. You know, they were together, their car was missing, so maybe they changed their names, got a new bank account, that sort of thing. But both Richard and Danielle had children, and they were fairly close to these children as well. So for them to just run away and leave their kids behind honestly seems absurd, and in my opinion kind of rules it out as a possibility. Police have been investigating this as a potential murder and kidnapping, but they have no bodies, they have no real other evidence. As I said, their car was never found, so it's a incredibly hard one, and for almost 20 years, this case has remained unsolved. Rick and Morty, the new Jared. So, this one is an interesting one for Rick and Morty fans as well as Subway fans. So shortly after the first season of Rick and Morty came out, Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon were approached by Subway, the sandwich company, to make a few commercials for them starring Rick and Morty. In these commercials, Rick and Morty do, you know, Rick and Morty things. Maybe try and imagine the Szechuan sauce commercials. But in these commercials, apparently, they, you know, did silly things, advertised Subway sandwiches, obviously, and claimed to be the new Jared. And this, of course, is referring to Jared Fogle, who was basically the spokesperson for Subway at the time. Now, this is where things get messy, because in 2015, Jared Fogle was actually arrested and sent to prison for 15 years for some really messed up stuff to do with children, which I won't get into, but you can Google it if you want to. And so, obviously, Subway immediately dropped Jared as a spokesperson, and because the commercials mostly revolved around references to Jared sort of thing, with Rick and Morty being the new Jared, these commercials were also dropped. Justin Roiland said the commercials were produced, but due to legal reasons, he can't release them or really talk about them too much. But he did say he put the commercials on 8 different thumb drives, and basically hid them all around America in, you know, random places, in public places, but he won't say where. He did say that 4 of them weren't there when he went to go check on them. So if we believe Justin Roiland, then there are, you know, maybe 4 people out there that have access to these commercials. But regardless, if people do have them, they haven't yet been released to the public or put online. So for now, Maybe not forever, but for now, they are considered lost media. The Riemann hypothesis is, well, I mean, just look at this. This might be one of the most complex entries on this list. Like, it looks like you actually need a master's degree to understand it. Maybe I'm just being a little dopey, but it is some complex mathematical stuff. That's all you need to know. It is maths, and it's complicated, being one of the few mathematical problems with a $1 million reward. It has not yet been solved, so the money has not been claimed, but hey, if you got an A on your high school maths exam, maybe give it a shot and try and win the million. Robert Hornbeck was a very strange, very sad case of a soldier in America in Georgia who went missing after a night out with a friend drinking, and he didn't turn up again for 12 days. This is when guests in the nearby hotel, the DeSoto Hilton, complained about a bad smell in the air, and when staff went up to check on where the smell was coming from inside this giant air conditioner, they found Robert. He had seemingly gotten very drunk, gone into the hotel in which he didn't even have a room, perhaps stumbled around in there, got lost, entered into the wrong room, like around the maintenance section, and seemingly stumbled into this air conditioning unit, got trapped in there, and ended up dying when a giant fan inside the unit caught him in the head. It is not known 100% certainly whether there was any foul play in this case. It doesn't seem like there is, just because of the way things were set up, but it is always a possibility. The last words that anyone heard Robert speak were to his dad on the phone, who was coming to pick him up after, a night out drinking, and he told his dad that he would be on the steps, presumably outside this hotel, but obviously, as we know, when the dad turned up, Robert just wasn't there, and it took them 12 whole days to actually find him. An extremely sad, simple case with not a lot of mystery, I don't think. The only unknown aspect of this case was really why Robert went in there, why he entered the hotel in the first place, and why he went further and further into the maintenance area, into the air conditioning unit. So a somewhat mysterious, but mostly very sad and tragic case. So grab a drink. My choice today is Darjeeling tea with milk, and join me as we explore the unsolved mysteries Iceberg. Robert Williams was a very tragic and mysterious case where a 15-year-old boy, Robert Williams, went missing from Neath in Wales in 2002. His mum last saw him when he was heading out for the day at around morning time, and he told his mum that he would be out for a while, which wasn't too untypical of Robert, as he was quite a social, active kid. So he left the house, and where he went after that is kind of unclear. We know that he did attend a house party at one point, but where he went before that, and also where he went after that, and where he ended up, we still really to this day don't really know. He seemingly just completely vanished, and it's not really known whether he vanished from the party itself, or whether he attended the party and then left to go somewhere and then vanished from there, or whether he just disappeared from somewhere else entirely. And this was 22 years ago, bear in mind. And in that entire time, they pretty much hadn't got any major leads until September of last year, where 2 people were arrested in connection to his disappearance. Now, the identities of these 2 people are at the moment undisclosed, and there's not too many details out there about them, but we do know that they are a 59-year-old woman and a 35-year-old man, meaning 21 years ago at the time of his disappearance, this would put them at 38 and 14 years of age, which some people have rightfully pointed out that this man, who was 14 years old at the time, may very well have been one of Robert's friends, acquaintances, schoolmates, as Robert himself was just a year older at 15. And the woman could very likely be this kid's mum, or this ex-kid. It's a strange way of saying adult, but I think it fits here. So did this kid perhaps know what happened to Robert? If they're being arrested for it, does it perhaps mean that they are somewhat, if not entirely, responsible? Maybe they gave Robert some drink, maybe something much worse, and he ended up, dying in their custody. So perhaps they just covered the whole thing up. Or perhaps, as some people have said, maybe they got into a fight, maybe it was a play fight, maybe it was a real fight, but either way, they took it too far, an accident happened, and Robert ended up dying, and this kid's mum ended up helping him hide the body, and in her eyes, protect her son from doing jail time. To me, a lot of these theories actually make sense, and as I said, the evidence isn't really out there at the moment. The details around these people also isn't really out there, so we will have to likely wait a little while to see how this develops. But hopefully this leads to some more arrests, some more breakthroughs in the case, and Robert's family can finally find out 22 years later what actually happened to their boy. The Ross Littlewood paradox, also known as the balls and vase problem, also known as the ping pong ball problem. Yeah, a lot of strange names. But this is once again another math problem. Yay, maths. So it's quite a complex one, but not as abstract as some of the other ones I've covered. So I think I can briefly explain it quite simply. It basically deals with infinity and how the concept of infinity is just super nutso for our brain to handle. So the balls and vase problem says that basically you have this hypothetical vase, say our mug here, and just imagine this mug is like infinite size. So first you put 10 balls into the mug, and then you remove one ball, which is a pretty simple little series of events. Then you put in 10 balls, and then you remove another ball, and you do this over and over and over and over again an infinite amount of times. And the question is, at the end of this infinite set of actions, how many balls will actually be in the vase? And that is basically the entire puzzle. Some say, well, you've added balls to the vase an infinite amount of times, so there are an infinite amount of balls currently in the vase. Others say, well, the last step every time is actually to remove one ball, and since you're doing it an infinite amount of times, you end up removing an infinite amount of balls from the vase. And so, since you've removed an infinite amount of balls from the vase, at the end of this sequence, the vase ends with 0 balls. And this is where the concept of infinity gets a little strange, I think, because you can't sum up infinities in quite the same way you can do with whole numbers. So, like, just because you've added 10 balls an infinite amount of times, it doesn't necessarily mean there's like 10 times infinity balls. Like, there's still just infinity. So when you remove one, it's not exactly like you're removing 1/10 of the balls, because again, you can't really have 1/10 of an infinite number. And if this is starting to hurt your brains a little bit, I do apologize. Infinity is a insane concept, and for this reason there is a third common answer to this question, which is that the answer is ill-defined because the question itself is ill-defined. As because it is an infinite string of tasks or actions, this means that it will never actually end. And since the actions of putting in balls and removing them never actually ends, the answer to how many balls are in the vase at the end is just kind of a poorly constructed question. It's like asking what color is the number 4. It just doesn't make sense to ask that sort of question. But regardless of where you stand on the answer to this question, it is mostly just designed as a way to get people to think, to conceive infinity, to think outside the box, to stretch their mind sort of thing. And in terms of the math world, it is very useful, but the answer is somewhat very mysterious, and it does hurt my head a little bit. The Skegness Bus Woman. So this was kind of an obscure case where, while on a bus heading to Skegness, which is this area in East England, 2 men on the bus got up and ended up, through some unknown series of events, shaking hands with this old woman. And then when they got off the bus, they realized that their hands had these puncture wounds on that were apparently from shaking hands with this old woman. They then rushed to the hospital to, make sure they weren't dying or anything. They did some checks, the tests all came back fine, and they were just told that, bandage them up, the puncture wounds would heal up soon. But the old lady on the bus was never found or questioned, and it's still unclear to this day whether she intentionally assaulted and injured these 2 men, stabbing them in the hand for whatever reason, or whether it was just a sheer accident. Maybe she had a sharp bracelet on or something, and their hands ended up getting punctured. As I said, kind of an obscure case, not too much to go on this one, but it is still a fairly unique and interesting mystery. Skyquakes are basically what they sound like, earthquakes, but in the sky. They are normally described as something like thunder thunder, but without the accompanying lightning, and are often, but not always, seen in perfectly clear skies. So obviously the cause for them is somewhat of a mystery. They occur basically worldwide, and since they occur worldwide, there are a bunch of different names for them from languages all around the world. They are called, for instance, the bombs of the sea in France, uminari or cries of the sea in Japan, mist poofers in Dutch, which is a hilarious name, fog guns, and much more. The cause for them hasn't yet been conclusively identified, but possible causes range from meteors entering the atmosphere, to the atmosphere itself kind of shifting or changing, to perhaps unseen volcanic eruptions or earthquakes, to a bunch of stuff possibly going on underneath the ground, underneath the water, like perhaps some escaping gas, or the collapsing of some underground caves. For me, a very interesting phenomenon, and one that I think might possibly have multiple explanations, but you can let me know your reasonable explanations in the comments below, or if you want to, your completely absurd theories about this one. And actually, I think I'll end up pinning the most entertaining one that I see. So no prize here, just fame and glory in the YouTube comment section. The Awful is actually a very appropriately named creature. It is this chimera-like beast that was first seen in Vermont in roughly the 1920s. It had a snake tail, these giant claws, an awful, see what I did there? An awful, terrifying head, and these huge wings that spanned up to 20 feet in width. It wasn't a bird, so I don't know why it would make bird noises. The first time it was spotted was when two sawmill workers who were crossing a bridge saw it up on a rooftop. They saw this thing up there staring down at them, and one of the men got so badly frightened that he immediately had a heart attack, which, yeah, that is pretty frightening. It wasn't really seen much after the 1930s, although there have been a few apparent sightings, some up as late as like 2006. And interestingly enough, when news of the Awful started to come out, started to spread, H.P. Lovecraft actually made his way over to Vermont, over to this town, to try and spot the Awful. And it is thought that the accounts of the Awful that H.P. Lovecraft got from the news, got from local people, got from rumors going around, from people actually spotting this creature, that all of these accounts basically went on to inspire H.P. Lovecraft in a bunch of the creatures and monsters that he ended up eventually creating. So, an interesting creature with a little bit of history. Was it just a hoax? Was it a pterodactyl-like creature? You know, a lost species, an ancient dinosaur? Was it perhaps an alien? Was it a giant bird? Was it an experiment? Or was it in fact a mythical griffin / chimera? The jury's kind of out, so I'll let you guys decide. If you are enjoying this video, do consider hitting that like button and subscribing if you like this sort of content. There are some really cool videos coming out in the next few months, which I would hate for you to miss out on. Let me know what you're drinking down below, and for now, let's get back to the video. The Simpsons comic Find Ned Flanders in this panel. So here we have another Screamer video. This is one, as you can imagine, in which the viewer is tasked with basically finding Ned Flanders in this comic book panel. And this panel is kind of like a Where's Waldo sort of thing. You know, you've got to look closely at the page, you've got to scour every little detail, and while you're really up close to it, searching really carefully for Ned Flanders, bam! A jump scare. And I'm pretty sure from the description that this is the face that was shown in the jump scare, along with this massively loud scream. But the video is no longer available on YouTube for whatever reasons, and so it is currently considered lost media. Tiffany Nelson was a 9-year-old girl who went missing from Augusta, Georgia in 1994. She was living with her auntie at the time, and it was a fairly normal, fairly standard summer's day, and Tiffany decided to head to the shops. So she got on her red bike that she was given for Christmas and headed towards the convenience store, which was really just a few minutes away. And after she left the house, she was never seen again, or rather she was never seen alive again. The next time she turned up was 14 years later, when some hunters who were out and about roaming, as hunters tend to do, found some bones, and through DNA tests, these were confirmed to be Tiffany's. There is honestly very little evidence for this case, very few suspects, and it is not currently known what exactly happened to Tiffany or who was responsible for Tiffany's death. One theory that actually originated from her older brother Tyrone was that he himself was indirectly responsible for Tiffany's death. And this all came out years after Tiffany's disappearance, but he basically told his auntie that there was this horrible guilt eating away at him, and he said that he was responsible for Tiffany's disappearance and death. He said that he was into, the herb and a bunch of other stuff, shall we say, and that back then, all those years ago, he ended up doing business with a man and his wife, and then he decided to beat the man up very, very badly, and he ended up taking back both the stuff and the money. So he basically beat him up and robbed him, and that he was convinced that because he had done this, that they had, sought out revenge, somehow found out where he lived, and it was someone connected to these people that ended up kidnapping Tiffany and killing her. Which, to me, this whole thing just sounds like the big brother beating himself up and guilting himself over not being able to protect his little sister. It's easy sometimes to look at things that you've done wrong as potentially the cause for something like this. And I'm not saying this isn't necessarily what happened, but it could just be not connected whatsoever, and the brother could very understandably just feel very guilty about what actually happened. There was also, on top of this, a call that came through to 911, and this was sometime after Tiffany's disappearance, and the call itself and the voice was kind of muffled, so they recorded the whole thing and ended up playing back the voice to Tiffany's mother, saying, can you confirm if this is Tiffany or not? And that whole confirmation was a little bit up in the air, but the call itself was apparently the voice of a little girl who said that she was taken from her home and she wants to go back home, and she said that two people took her and actually gave their names, but the names she gave were also somewhat muffled, and so police weren't really able to identify these two names, which isn't really ideal. Some theories say that the two names that the girl gave were the names of two of Tyrone's friends, and that they actually had, something to do with this, which is, totally possible, but absolutely nothing that would hold up in court. And others do say that it is a tiny bit of a stretch, and that the phone call is really just so muffled that you could almost apply any name to them, which is also a very good point. The end of this phone call just hangs up abruptly, which makes it seem almost like the person making the call panicked and just hung up, or the call was hung up for them. Tiffany herself was an absolute bundle of joy. She was always smiling, always happy, always kind, and sadly, as you know, as I've just told you, the case has not yet been solved, though it is still open, and 30 years later, the investigations into it still continue. The Trades Hall bombing. So this was a seemingly targetless random attack in Trades Hall, Wellington, New Zealand in 1984. This suitcase was left in the lobby of the building by we don't really know who, and when the caretaker of the building discovered it and went to move it, the suitcase just immediately exploded. The blast was equivalent to roughly 1 kilogram of dynamite, which is a powerful explosion, and the motive and culprit for this attack has never been found or determined. This building, the Trades Hall, was the headquarters for a bunch of different trade unions, so it is thought that the person behind this attack likely, for some reason, didn't like trade unions. Perhaps he even passionately hated them, in order to justify doing something like this. It's not like he just disliked them or he was protesting, like he literally killed someone over this. The police had like 1 or 2 quite weak leads on the case, and neither of these really panned out. But as I said, police were convinced that whoever did this likely hated the trade unions, and likely the trade unions were the target of their attack. So maybe it was a form former worker for one of these trade unions. Maybe he owned a company that the trade unions were interfering with. Maybe he was just late for work one day due to a tube or train strike or something. Nobody really knows. But a strange case, a very sad case for the caretaker that was killed, Ernie Abbott. And due to just how this case is structured, it seems unlikely that it'll be solved really anytime soon, if ever. The Triassic Kraken. And when I read this for the first time, I actually read it as the Triassic Karen, which would have been interesting. I don't know if dinosaurs had managers that a Karen could complain to back in the Triassic era, but no, this was the Triassic Kraken, which was theorized to be a kraken as large as a school bus that lived back in the Triassic Age. It was first proposed by a paleontologist, Mark McMenamin, which is a hell of a name, man. But he found this squid beak, which he said, due to its size, must have belonged to a giant kraken or octopus or squid from that era that was between 10 and 30 meters in length. And I guess the more wild part of this discovery and proposal is the discovery of some of these bones, which actually belonged to these creatures, the Shonisaurus. Now, bear with me here because it does get a tiny bit confusing, but octopuses have kind of been known to like decorate their homes sort of thing. You know, grab things, grab stones, grab shells, just place things around. And so Mark said that these bones, the bones of the Shonisaurus, the way they were laid out was like very artistic. And so these bones couldn't have been placed there by accident, but were the result of this giant kraken killing a few Shonisauruses and then decorating its home with their bones as something like artwork, I guess, around the kraken's home, which, I mean, Christ, that is a wild theory. And there are a few things that are quite wrong with it, as the theory has been attacked by some other prominent scientists and paleontologists. One being that octopuses don't really make artwork around their home, but really they just kind of grab random things that are around, scatter them around their home, around the entrances to their home, to basically act as like a camouflage, so their entrance isn't super obvious as an entrance. You know, there's other random bits and bobs scattered all around there. Two, the tooth that he found, that he said was evidence for this giant kraken-like creature, actually seems to be, upon further inspection, smaller than he originally claimed, meaning that the squid or kraken that he proposed was also likely a lot smaller than he originally proposed. And even if this kraken creature was as large as he said, as large as a school bus, it'd still only really be a few tons in weight, while the Shonisauruses were thought to be an estimated 20 to 30 tons in weight, and they typically hunted and killed large squids. So yeah, even if this thing did exist, it likely would have been lunch to these Shonisauruses. And so the idea of this giant kraken killing these Shonisauruses is firstly absurd, and then decorating its home with their bones, like some kind of flex or something, is seemingly just all sorts of nonsense. So a wild theory by apparently an even wilder dude, but there you go. U/snapped fingers. So this is a absolutely wild and disturbing case. And shout out to Eudoxia for basically investigating this case and putting together a fantastic video covering it. Link in the description below if you'd like to check it out, or in fact check out any of his other stuff. His channel is honestly fantastic. But if you do go there, leave him a comment saying that Connor sent you. But Snapped Fingers was the name of this Reddit user who posted many posts roughly like 4 to 5 years ago. And these posts paint the story of this seriously unhinged and disturbed individual. I won't go into too many graphic details about this one, as it does honestly get a little gruesome, but our story starts about Snapped Fingers all the way back in 2019-2020. This was in the Confession Reddit, and he confessed that since as far back as he can remember, he has seen things and heard things that weren't really there. So, you know, voices, what he thought were demons, and one time he was putting up a set of shelves, and then he saw this black demon-like thing crawling up his arm, and he panicked and tried to stop this demon, and so the drill that he was holding, he ended up just jamming that into his arm, which apparently stopped the demon, but also meant he needed to go to the hospital. And he told them it was an accident. He got the wound treated. It wasn't super fatal or anything like that. But yeah, he said he lied to them at the time and told them it was a complete accident because he didn't want to seem crazy. Then he made posts about how he always saw these illusions, these demons, and had seemingly witnessed some pretty disturbing things in the past, like for instance someone getting hit by a train, and said he didn't really react or feel anything at all, which honestly might be the sign of a psychopath or sociopath, or someone with just massive trauma who has basically numbed themselves. And although he said a bunch of his relatives, a bunch of the people he spoke to, believed in stuff like ghosts and supernatural beings, etc., Snapped Fingers said he never really did believe in those things, and instead said he believed these things that were attacking him were actually interdimensional beings, which I'll use interdimensional beings and demons kind of interchangeably throughout this, but that is where he thought that they came from, and they thought that they were, for lack of a better word, haunting him, stalking him, attacking him, and just generally harassing him. So he got to talking to multiple people on multiple different forums, on Reddit, obviously, on various Discord servers, and he would ask them for help, and they would basically just troll him. A few people told him that in order to fight off and keep these demons away from him, that he needed to basically offer a piece of himself to, you know, satiate their hunger. Like, for example, drawing blood, like cutting off one of his fingers. So yeah, some incredible, irresponsible advice to give someone over the internet. And he kind of seemed to be naive enough to believe some of these things, but he was still seemingly scared and a little cautious about following through on some of these. Most of the comments, to be fair, were trying to get this guy help, saying, you know, these people on Discord are trying to fool you, they're trying to trick you, they're just trolling you, they don't care about you, and telling him, look, get off the internet, get off these forums, and go seek medical help. And he actually said that he had been on medication before, but that firstly it didn't really help, which actually just further proved to himself that these demons were real, because he said if it were all in his head, then the medicine would have stopped them, which is not a fantastic thing to think. And he also said he didn't want to be seen as crazy by doctors, so he just didn't go to them. He basically says that he has no one else in his life to discuss these things with, and so these Redditors and Discord users are all that he has. And someone does bring up the question of, you know, are you sober now? Are you on anything? And he said he's never really on anything. He doesn't even drink coffee, he said. So it seems like whatever was causing these delusions wasn't external. He then goes on for multiple posts about how he's new to this whole interdimensional demon thing, and he's looking for advice on how to protect himself from them, how to quiet them or make them happy, and how to kill and destroy them. And as we mentioned earlier, there were some people saying that he needed to sacrifice a piece of himself, whether that be a finger, whether that be an entire limb, which is again so stupidly irresponsible. And he's constantly doubting it and saying he kind of believes them, but he's not really sure, and so he's looking for basically further validation on this all. And he comes across, at least to me, as just very disturbed, very naive, and somewhat very scared. He then gets convinced somehow that there is a portal to hell, or, you know, to these interdimensional demons in the catacombs beneath Paris, and that all of these demons that have been harassing him basically his entire life all come from that portal. And so he has a plan to fly over to Paris and basically destroy it. Yeah, some wild stuff. And this was all happening during the, you know, crazy stuff that happened in 2020. So there were a bunch of places and things that were on lockdown, a bunch of airports that were closed, and so he basically had to take a flight over somewhat illegally, and then later says that these demons actually released the thing that was, you know, released in 2020 upon the world for the sole purpose of shutting down these airports and of stopping Snapped Fingers from getting to Paris and destroying the portal, which it's like, I mean, I thought these delusions couldn't get any more delusional, but he has clearly proved me wrong. And this all sounds, very extreme, somewhat funny. Like if you're just reading it, if you think it's a prank or a joke or something, it is very absurd. But people like this do provably exist. And so you have to think, if this person was being genuine and they were truly, honestly believing this, going through with this, if you imagine one of your loved ones in this exact scenario, then it is extremely sad and heartbreaking to experience and watch. He eventually, according to his posts, makes it to Paris. He lives, rough on the streets, traveling for a few days or a few weeks, it's a little unclear. He says he came unprepared, he didn't really bring enough money for the trip, and he was worried that he was going to get caught or end up having to go back to America, empty-handed. And the demons at this point, he said, were getting more aggressive, more agitating, and were harassing him more and more and more aggressively, because he said they knew why he was in Paris, and they knew how close he was to destroying the portal, and basically the source of their power and source of their existence. So he seems to be going through a very rough time. And eventually, finally, he posts this, which you can pause it and read it all if you wish, but he basically says about how he made it to Paris and that he was preparing to enter the catacombs and will actually enter them within a few hours. And he has some, idea of how he's going to destroy the portals once he gets down there. And then after this post, he basically just goes radio silent, and nothing is really heard from him for a few years. And then he finally comes out, posts again, and says that he is sorry for all the drama that he caused, for all of the worry and stress that he caused everyone, and that what happened on that night was that he barely made it down into the catacombs, and he ended up finding no portals, and is now seeking help for what he knows to be illusions now, or delusions, sorry. And yeah, that's basically the end of it. Again, you can pause and read this if you wish, but he basically admits that he knows now it was all a delusion. He apologizes to everyone for the hassle caused and says that he is currently getting medical help, which is very good. And after this post, this was the last time he was officially heard from again. A few people are convinced that he was actually being hunted down by interdimensional demons, but it's hard to tell whether these people are actually being sincere or not. But most people basically fall into two camps. One, that the entire thing was a hoax, a prank committed by someone just to fool the internet and mess around with them. Or two, that this snapped fingers individual was a genuinely unstable, unhinged person who was being sincere and honest the entire time and who genuinely needed help. And for me, it is a little tough to say on this one, honestly. It is on the internet, and as we all know, stuff on the internet can be sometimes hard to tell whether it's, real or not. But at the same time, it could very well have been a, unstable person making these posts. As we know, people like this do exist, so someone like this being on the internet making posts isn't, completely out of the realm of possibility. Some people think that the original Snapped Fingers account was actually hacked, and so these posts that were posted like 2 years after, the ones I showed saying that he was sorry and that he's getting help now, that these weren't actually by the original user, but were by whoever hacked their account, which, is possible, but I don't know why you'd hack an account and post something like this. Like, surely you'd want to kind of egg up the drama sort of thing, but we have no real way of proving this. But if the last post of them was saying they'd go down into the catacombs and destroy these portals, then there are obviously theories about what actually happened to this individual. Whether they found the portals and were, killed by the demons, whether they ended up getting lost or trapped in the catacombs, whether they were arrested or, picked up and taken to a facility either in France or in America. There's almost no evidence or clues for any of this, which leads to a bunch of different theories on it. It's unlikely we'll ever really get a solid answer for this one, but boy, this was a deep rabbit hole of a case. And yeah, once again, I couldn't have done it without Eudoxia's video and coverage. So check out his stuff if you're interested. He does some fantastic videos, and definitely show him some love. The Ulster County John Doe. So this was a man who was found dead, decomposed in 1988, New York. He, obviously being a John Doe, was unidentified, but found on him were clothes that he was obviously wearing that seemed to be French. So naturally, police first thought him to be a Frenchman, but also on him they found this, which is obviously a photograph of not necessarily him. They said it was possibly him because the man had decomposed quite a bit. They said that the man in the photograph was possibly him, but possibly another man, maybe a relative, maybe a friend, maybe just someone random, we don't really know, and a child. Neither the man in the photo or the child were able to be identified, and so to this day the man that was found still remains a John Doe. The Wallowa Lake freshwater crustaceans. So these were these giant crabs essentially that were mentioned by early settlers and explorers in Oregon, and then these giant crustaceans were just, I guess, never seen again. Like, they seemingly just vanished into thin air. The described size of these things would make them larger than any crab we have ever seen before. And yeah, what happened to them is still unknown. Maybe they were wiped out by humans or another animal. Maybe they ended up migrating when the humans came and are still undiscovered. Or maybe these settlers just, exaggerated the size of these crabs and they weren't really as big as they said they were. We don't really know, but what we absolutely do know is that giant crabs would be absolutely terrifying. I mean, honestly, look at this bloody thing called the Sandwalker. Just nightmare fuel. The Warminster thing is not too terrifying of a name, I guess. But this was basically a series of UFO sightings that happened in the 1960s in Warminster, England. Now, it should be noted that Warminster is only like 15 minutes away from Stonehenge, which, I mean, take from that what you will, but aliens, Stonehenge, all I'm saying is there might be something here. So on this day in 1964, it was Christmas Day, and Mildred Head woke up, this was in the middle of the night, and heard this crazy loud racket on the top of her roof. So she got up to kind of check what it was. She looked out the window, but just saw absolutely nothing. Then she heard a loud humming noise that got louder and louder and louder, and then just faded away. Yeah, I know. Spooky stuff. There was another lady who was knocked down to the ground by the force of, and I quote, savage sound waves, which is just hilarious. That's how I imagine savage sound waves to sound. Some soldiers in a nearby army camp witnessed something similar to this, in that there were loud, massive disturbances on one of their roofs, as did a man named Roger Rump and his wife, which... Roger Rump sounds like a made-up name, but those are just the names you get here in England. All in all, on Christmas Day that year, there were more than 30 reported similar cases of strange noises and strange hums and disturbances and rooftop incidents. Now, I know what you're thinking. Loud whoosh noises, people being knocked over, windows rattling. I mean, this all could just be, the wind. And to that I say no, because just a few days later, an entire flock of pigeons died. Just suddenly, mysteriously, out of nowhere. And as we all know, wind cannot kill pigeons because they, live in wind. It'd be like a fish drowning. So therefore, this Warminster thing is not wind. A month after this, more families heard strange disturbances, strange things up on the roof. And a few months after that, a bunch of people noticed and witnessed things flying in the sky, seemingly UFOs, sightings like that. And some described what they saw as a cigar-shaped craft. Some saw other crafts that were blinking or covered in lights. Some said that they saw, try and imagine this, 2 red-hot pokers hanging down, one on top of the other, which is an incredible way to describe something. The sightings became more and more numerous until in the summer, the news spread about this thing going on in this small little town, and in one weekend, an estimated 8,000 people came from all over the country to this small little town in order to perhaps investigate for themselves, perhaps catch a glimpse of one of these strange sightings. This photo was taken by a local resident of what he believed to be a UFO, and then it was posted on the local newspaper and then on the national newspaper, and then things, no pun intended, maybe slightly intended, things just got crazier and busier than ever before. There were books written about these events and sightings. The BBC made a documentary on it. There were shops set up, there was merchandise developed and made, there were UFO tours arranged in this town. It was like a genuine little attraction within the town. People would come from all over the country to come and take part. But this only really lasted a few years, and by the mid-1970s, sightings slowly became less and less numerous. People stopped filming, they stopped writing books about it, and the tourists to the town just slowly slowed down, and people eventually stopped coming. There are still a few UFO sightings in Warminster, often kind of 1 or 2 every few years or so, but nowhere near as numerous as the 1960s. It is more well known now for its, quaint buildings, a few of its sites, and the scenery in the town, which, I mean, is kind of sad. This super cool, almost UFO town is no longer really known for that. But it is part of life, I guess, part of change, and we have to accept that. A really cool little period of time for this town, but it is still unknown as to what actually caused these and what the Warminster thing actually was. The X-17 particle was this proposed hypothetical particle that might help to explain and actually be connected to dark matter. That lovely, mysterious matter that makes up 85% of all matter in the universe, and we can't see it, can't really directly observe it, and can only somewhat measure it through like estimates and complex math. So that's fun and not terrifying at all. But basically, and I'll try and simplify this down as I do with a lot of these complex entries, but they were basically doing a test, and there was this anomaly in the results of the test. And basically one way to explain this anomaly is by the existence of this proposed particle. Now, one of the reasons why this particle is and might be super special is that if it exists, its existence and behavior might help explain more of what dark matter is, and might potentially be evidence for a fifth force. So right now we have electromagnetism, we have gravity, and we have strong and weak nuclear forces. And these are the 4 forces in the universe. But as I said, this particle might actually end up proving a fifth force. So some super fun stuff that might actually end up being a massive scientific breakthrough. But for now, the potential existence of this particle and the cause of that anomaly in the test that they did is still an unsolved mystery. The Yakima Jane Doe was a lady likely in her 20s, found in Yakima, Washington in 1977. She had been found in a van that was seemingly abandoned in this parking lot, and at the time she was quite heavily mutilated, and she was badly decomposed, which made identifying her somewhat difficult. The case itself was honestly a bit of a mess as well, as they ended up losing or misplacing her dental records. There was a janitor who ended up throwing out her clothes, so evidence, which is some fantastic security you have there. And on top of that, her skull ended up going missing. So great. She was likely strangled to death just based on the injuries, and that's about really as far as they got with the case. And as I said, she was found in 1977, so she has been basically unidentified for the past 46 years, and this honestly looks like a case that probably will never be solved. Ślizgawka w Łazienkach is firstly a really hard name to say, but this was possibly the first ever Polish film made. It was directed by a guy named... here we go again. Kazimierz Pruszyński. And this was in 1896. Well, 1896 at the absolute latest. It could have been a few years before this. And interestingly enough, it was actually filmed on a very early prototype of a camera that he himself, the director, actually invented. So yeah, some super cool stuff. It was a super short film, I guess you could say, around 1 to 3 minutes long. And it featured a group of ice skaters skating around an ice rink in Warsaw. These 4 frames here are all that remain of the film, as they were posted in an early newspaper article. But where the rest of the film is to this day, we have no idea. It may very well have just been lost to time, with the old film either having been destroyed or decayed or lost, or it might still be around somewhere, either in the back of someone's attic sort of thing, or in a collection somewhere, but we really have no idea, and so this is a very early form of lost media. Tammy Lynn Leppert was the tragic, sad case of this 18-year-old girl, model, actress, beauty queen, who went missing in Florida 1983. Now, she, as I said, was a beauty queen. She had been a lot of her life modeling or acting, and she had been in actually quite a few films, albeit in minor roles, but she was in stuff like Scarface, she was in a film called Little Darlings, and in one called Spring Break. And so this whole case basically starts after the filming of Spring Break. This was in 1983, and after the filming was done, Tammy, who was apparently looking for a little break of her own, decided to head to this party all alone. And something happened there. We're not sure what, but after this party, Tammy's friends and family noticed that Tammy was acting pretty strange. Like, ever since this party, she wasn't acting herself, she seemed a little paranoid, she seemed scared often, and her mother was convinced that Tammy was fearing for her life, basically. And whatever happened at that party seemingly convinced Tammy that there was someone out to get her, that she was in danger, and that she would eventually be either kidnapped, killed, or both. Her mum, understandably being obviously worried for Tammy, first had her check in with a medical professional to see if it wasn't, all in her head. And the medical professionals did some checks, they did, minor investigation sort of thing, and they said she was basically fine to go and released her after 3 days. So that leads us to July 6th that same year. And this day, July 6th, was when Tammy was last seen alive. She was on the day being driven somewhere by a male friend of hers, and this male friend picked her up at her home and was driving her somewhere when the two had an argument in the car. This led to him stopping the car, her getting out at this parking lot, and he was the last person to see Tammy alive. The guy who dropped her off was obviously investigated, but they didn't really move forward with him as a suspect. They thought he likely didn't commit this crime, but Tammy's mother did say later on that Tammy said that she was afraid of this guy, her male friend. So, I mean, make of that what you will. But as far as suspects go, there was really two major ones in this case. One was a man named Christopher Wilder, who was a serial killer who was known to be operating in Florida at the time, and John Crutchley, who was another serial killer operating in this area at this time. So yeah, lots of murder happening in Florida. Both of these men were investigated and were kept as suspects, all the way up until their deaths in 1984 and 2002 respectively. And obviously, these men were never charged for Tammy's disappearance or death, and if they did know anything, they ended up taking it to their graves. Another theory was that at this party that Tammy attended, she either saw or heard something that she shouldn't have seen or heard, and thought that someone would potentially kidnap or kill her in order to protect their secret. And she may honestly have been right on that one. Now, again, in relation to the party that she went to, there were some people who thought, some, rumors going around, that Tammy, at the time of her disappearance, was actually 3 months pregnant, which, might explain why after the party, Tammy seemed a little shaken, a little traumatized almost, and perhaps, maybe whoever did this to her found out she was pregnant, wanted to cover things up. And again, this was never confirmed, it was just kind of rumors and theories, but it is a possibility. After Tammy went missing, obviously searches were started, investigations were done, interviews were done, but Tammy just never turned up, and they never really found any evidence for where she might have gone, who might have taken her, what else might have happened. And some of the biggest evidence actually that they got were these 2 phone calls, and they were from a lady saying that they knew that Tammy was alive and that she was basically in hiding and had, run away from all the attention and all of the showbiz, and that she would contact her loved ones when the time was right, which honestly, to me, just sounds like the biggest attempt at a cover-up ever. Like, you know, it sounds like someone did something to Tammy, and then in order to make it seem like everything's fine, she just ran away, you know? They made these calls, or they got someone else to make them on their behalf. Tammy, of course, never did turn up. She never did end up contacting anyone, so that makes the phone calls seem even more suspicious. And that's basically where the case ended up. As I said, the two major suspects died years later, and they were never really able to get any evidence of them, any confessions. So Tammy, still to this day, 40 years later, is still a missing person, and we have no idea what actually happened to her on that fateful day in Florida. The Caldwell Field murders was honestly a brutally sad case. It involved the murders of two students in Virginia, 18-year-old Heidi Childs and 19-year-old David Metzler. This all happened in 2009. It was a pretty nice and standard summer's day, and so David had, planned the date in Jefferson National Park. And the plan was basically to have like a picnic campfire of sorts. Shortly after dark, David would drive him and Heidi up to this park, start a small little fire, sit around it, play some guitar, super romantic stuff. They didn't plan on camping out there. They didn't plan on staying out too late, as both of them were pretty good students. They had a ton of work to do, and, they were pretty well behaved in general. So David's roommates kind of knew he would be back, later that evening. Heidi told her roommates basically the same thing. She'd be out for maybe a few hours and then would return home. And so that evening, just after dark, David went to pick Heidi up. Heidi ran out from her apartment, got in David's car, and they ended up going together to this national park. And then, come evening time, neither David nor Heidi returned home. At first, their roommates started to get a little bit worried, but they kind of thought, they are uni students. Maybe they stayed out a little bit later. Maybe David stayed over at Heidi's house, or like vice versa. Maybe they got a motel or a hotel somewhere, which was not too likely, but it also wasn't too unreasonable to imagine that either. So none of the roommates really did anything that night. But when they woke up the next day and still neither of them had returned, they started to get a little bit worried. Some of David's roommates went over to Heidi's place and checked with her roommates, and when they also said that neither of them had returned, then they decided to get in a car and drive up to the national park to search for the couple themselves. And just before they were able to do this, they received news that David and Heidi were found, and they had both been killed, both shot dead in the car park of the national park. They were found in the early morning by a man walking his dog, and for whatever reason, it is still completely unclear, they were both shot dead while either in or near their car. David was collapsed over the steering wheel, having been shot once through the driver's side window, and Heidi had collapsed just outside the car, likely, opening the door and making a run for it when David was shot. A bunch of Heidi's stuff was missing: her phone, her purse, her ID badge, and her camera, which seems to maybe lean to it being a robbery of sorts, but none of David's stuff was missing. He had his wallet still in his pocket, a bunch of cash still in the wallet. So, it seems like if you're killing two people over a robbery, that you would maybe at least take, everything. So it is kind of strange that David's stuff was still on him. And if you say, well, it was probably just a spur of the moment attack, they quickly tried to rob the couple, and then when they didn't comply, they shot them in a panic, you could say that, except for the fact that the murder weapon was a 30-30 hunting rifle, which is this fucking thing that looks like it's from the 1800s. It is a huge, clunky lever action rifle that is basically only used for hunting, and not exactly the type of weapon that you would take with you when going to rob someone. It's not exactly small or conspicuous, it's rather clunky to use, and so there's theories that say that this was maybe a hunting accident gone wrong, although at the time this happened, hunting season was already over. So was someone hunting illegally, and did David and Heidi potentially see them? But still, it seems absurd that someone would kill over just being spotted hunting illegally. That seems to me like an absurd explanation. Or could it be that the explanation for this unusual weapon was that this was the only weapon that the killer could get their hands on? So one theory put forward that this was perhaps another student student who, for whatever reason, wanted to kill David and Heidi, and maybe the only gun that they could get their hands on was something like their dad's hunting rifle or something, and so that's what they used. But still, it does seem a bit strange, because surely that would be something that would be easy to identify, easy to track, so that doesn't really seem like a satisfying answer either. Could it have been a completely random, completely wild, crazed attacker who, just came out here with this random weapon and just attacked the first people he saw? That's always a possibility, I suppose. But that's basically all we have on this case. Possibilities and theories. There were no witnesses for this attack. As I said, the bodies were found many, many hours later in the morning. There was very little DNA evidence at the scene, and although there is a $100,000 reward for information leading to the solving of this case, that reward has never been claimed, and so this case, while still open, does remain a unfortunate, tragic, incredibly sad mystery. Chiho Anjitsu was the case of a 20-year-old swimming coach who went missing in Japan in 1992. And I owe a big part of my research on this case to a YouTuber named Kyoto Robato. There was very little evidence and information to find on this case, but Kyoto has done a fantastic job of grabbing it from all sorts of places and in compiling it into this super informative, super well put together video. So go check out his full video if you'd like. Link is down in the description below, and show Kyoto some love if you do go over there, and as always, let him know that Connor sent you. But this was in 1992 September, and on this day Chiho got up, drove to school like she normally did, and walked throughout the day, finishing at around 7 in the evening. She got in her car, left the school parking lot, and after this was never seen alive again. That evening, when she failed to come home, her family obviously got quite worried, so her mum called up the school, and they said that Chiho had basically left like normal, and she wasn't currently at the school. So that is a little worrying. Everything was seemingly from the school side completely normal, except for the fact that when Chiho left the car park, she left through the opposite exit that she normally takes. So towards one side is like the direction of her home, which is the exit she took pretty much every single day, and the other exit is, basically going away from her home. So it seems like when Chiho left, she wasn't intending on going home, so the next obvious question was, where was she going? And I think more importantly, who was she meeting? So as we discussed, she left the parking lot at around 7 in the evening, and after she didn't come home and her mum got worried, the mum ended up going with Chiho's sister to the school to investigate, and they arrived there at around 10 in the evening. So it was around 3 hours after Chiho had left, and even though Chiho's car had been seen leaving the parking lot earlier in the day, when the mum and sister arrived, they were somewhat shocked to see Chiho's car seemingly still in the parking lot. Now, the car itself seemed to have been parked up in somewhat of a hurry. It was parked over like 2 parking bays, and the end of the car had smashed into the little bollard at the end of each parking space. So it seems like whoever parked up did so in somewhat of a hurry. So they thought this was very strange. The car was here, Chiho wasn't here, so they went up to the car to, try and investigate, try and look for clues, and when they got there, looking through the window, they saw Chiho, and Chiho seemed to be asleep. She was reclined in one of the seats, and so the mum and sister tried to, knock on the window, wake Chiho up, and then eventually they opened the door and turned on the light in the car, and it was at this point that they realized that their daughter and sister, Chiho, was dead. They noticed she had marks on her neck, almost as if she'd been strangled. Her clothes were a little bit dirty, and immediately they ran to a nearby business, had them, call the authorities, the police, the ambulance, and I can't even imagine how tough it must have been for them. Soon after this, the police arrived, they started an investigation, they started looking for clues and evidence, and they found the things that I mentioned earlier, the dirt on Chiho's clothes, the strangulation marks around her neck, but they also noticed a bunch of dirt in the wheels of the car. So this, combined with the dirt and mud on Chiho's clothes, seemed to indicate that for some reason both Chiho and the car had very recently been off-road, whether that was in a field or a forest or a park, but somewhere that wasn't a road. So this essentially was their first clue as to where this attack might have taken place. So, they kind of put a large ring around the area as being the maximum distance that Chiho and the car might have traveled and then come back within this 3-hour time period. So they were doing their, searches, their investigation, but what really blew the case open wide was this little leaf that was found in Chiho's hair. And so police thought that if they could find the type of tree that it belonged to, this might help narrow down the area they need to search in. And this helped narrow it down more than they could ever imagine. The leaf belonged to a type of tree named a metasequoia, and this tree was so incredibly rare, like unbelievably rare, that it was thought to be extinct not too long ago. And the tree doesn't actually grow naturally in Japan, only in certain parts of China. So like, what the hell is going on here? Naturally, the police, using this evidence, started to look for places which might own metasequoias or might be able to grow them, and almost immediately they found a testing facility that actually had some metasequoias growing somewhat nearby. In fact, incredibly nearby, as this is a map of Chiho's home, the testing facility, and the swimming school, so all very nearby one another. So police then drove over to this testing facility, cordoned off the whole area, and they found there one of Chiho's shoes and some of Chiho's hair, basically confirming that this is where the attack took place. Now, in the further investigations and in trying to paint an entire picture of what happened that night, these were a few of the things that the police had noted. One, the fact that the car had been returned to the school meant that this wasn't just some random attack. Like, the killer, after killing Chiho, knew exactly where she taught, and if you remember earlier, the killer parked over to parking bays, number 2 and number 3, and Chiho's regular parking spot was in number 2. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the killer likely tried to return the car to the exact same parking spot as would normally be expected. But obviously he was in a rush, he went over the parking bays, and he hit into the concrete bollard at the back. So the fact that the killer knew all of this information meant that perhaps the killer was a colleague, was a friend of Chiho's, was a potential lover that she had, been discussing things with, or been someone that had, stalked her, watched her, seen where she works, seen exactly where she parked. But if that was the case, then it's unclear who Chiho was meeting that day, as nobody else came forward as, having a date or having an appointment with her. So it seems like whoever she went out to meet, that this person was the killer, and not just a random person that was, on the street or ambushed her or something like that. Now, she wasn't known to have a boyfriend at the time, but then again, it's not too unusual, especially in Japan, for people to, date or go out on dates or talk about things before introducing them to their friends and family as like an official boyfriend sort of thing. And so with Chiho leaving at around 7 p.m. and the car being returned by around 9 p.m., this leaves Chiho and the car gone for 2 hours? So the obvious question is, what exactly happened in these 2 hours? Well, the most common thought, just based on witness testimony, based on people seeing the car, that Chiho left the school parking lot and ended up driving to a restaurant where she, for whatever reason, and whoever, ended up meeting someone, which I think the police are implying that this was a planned meeting. So she had arranged to meet someone at this restaurant. The person, whoever she met, ended up getting into the driver's seat. She got into the passenger seat of her car, and then together, for whatever reason, they ended up driving to this area with the metasequoia tree. Now, along this little road that the metasequoia tree was on, there were a bunch of motels and hotels, and the road itself is actually known for containing all of these motels. So one theory, one version or story of events, was that Chiho went to meet a potential date or her potential boyfriend at this restaurant. The boyfriend said, look, let's take a drive somewhere, ended up driving to this area full of motels, had some, untoward thoughts, maybe tried to pressure Chiho into booking into one of the hotels with him, and maybe when she said no, that she didn't want to, he ended up getting mad, getting frustrated, and driving the two to this secluded area where he, seemingly had his way with her. Her clothes were torn in the abdomen section, as well as, below the abdomen. So they seemingly arrived there, whatever happened, happened. Chiho was likely strangled with the straps on her own clothes, and then the killer put her back in the car, drove all the way back to the swimming pool car park, left the car there, and disappeared. Now, as I said, this is partly evidential, partly speculation. We don't have too much evidence for this, but it seems like the likely progression of events. And for this case, during the investigation, there were thousands and thousands of potential suspects, which they slowly narrowed down to first a few thousand, then a little bit less than 1,000, then just a few hundred, and then just really a handful. But they were never able to prove that it was just one person, and so that is basically as far as the case got. Sadly, with there just being no witnesses, not enough evidence, the police just soon enough came to a dead end, and this case was never solved. And the police chief who was in charge of this investigation actually later wrote a book titled Sorry Chiho, in which he goes into detail about one particular suspect who he believes almost 100% was responsible for Chiho's death, and he said he has always felt guilt about not being able to bring this man to justice. He called the man Yamada as like a cover name because he didn't want to give away his identity for legal purposes, because, you know, it wasn't proven that this guy killed Chiho. But Yamada was basically a suspect right from the start, but he gave an alibi, so police moved on to someone else. But then his blood type matched some of the DNA found at the scene, so they went back to Yamada, did some more investigating, and found that his original alibi was quite likely false. But then they couldn't really get any more evidence on him, and so it was kind of this back and forth where they were barely not able to convict him. Like, as I said, the police chief was convinced it was him, and just with a little more evidence really, they would probably be able to convict him. But that never did end up happening. All of the evidence was either non-existent or circumstantial, and because Yamada never confessed to the crime, he was in the end just never charged. And that is where this case currently sits. And interestingly and somewhat disturbingly enough, when this case happened in 1992, the law in Japan actually had a statute of limitations on murder, meaning even on murder, if the case wasn't solved after 15 years, then it was basically as if the case and the murder had never happened. You know, after 15 years, no one could be charged for it, even if they came forward and confessed to it and provided evidence for it, they still couldn't legally be convicted. This is absolutely fucking nuts, and it was quite rightfully changed in 2010, where now there is no statute of limitations on murder. But as of 2007, exactly 15 years after this murder, the case was officially closed, and even if someone today comes forward and confesses to it, there's nothing the police or the law can do to charge them with it. So actually, justice can never be served, and the case can never be solved because it technically doesn't exist anymore because of this crazy law. So a wild one, a strange one, a brutal one, and I hope Chiho finds some peace wherever she might be. Jason Yolkowski was a 19-year-old guy who went missing from his home state of Nebraska in 2001. He was a part-time student who also worked in a restaurant, and he had a shift in the restaurant on that day, and because his car was in the shop at the time, he decided to just walk the 4 miles from his house to the restaurant. Then one of his co-workers was like, "No, dude, that is way too far to walk. Let me give you a ride." And so Jason accepted the ride, and that's basically what they planned to do. The co-worker said that he would pick him up at one of the nearby schools, which meant a lot less walking for Jason. And so Jason that morning, that afternoon, left his home, made his way to the local school, which is just like a few blocks away. But when his co-worker got to the school, Jason was nowhere to be seen. So he drove to Jason's house, and they basically said that Jason had left on time to go to the school. So something was clearly up. They reported Jason missing. They checked all the cameras at the school and saw that Jason never actually made it that far, and that was the last time that he was ever seen. He disappeared somewhere, sometime between his home and I guess the local school, but where he went, who else might have been involved, we still to this day don't know. Jason wasn't this dodgy kid, and the disappearance wasn't in the middle of the night. It was like literally in broad daylight. Jason was also a 6'1" guy, so the idea of someone, you know, manhandling him on the street again in broad daylight and kidnapping him, throwing him into a car, all seems like incredibly absurd. And then also what they might have done with him afterwards, you know, is also a little strange. Like, if you're kidnapping someone like this, maybe you leave a ransom note or demand a ransom, but absolutely none of that happened. It's like he just vanished into thin air. The other potential explanation is of Jason running away, but he didn't really seem like the running away type. He had a family there, he had his friends, he had a job, he had his school that he was working on, and his younger brother, which for him to leave all of that behind without telling anyone is also a little strange. And so that is basically where the case sits today. There's not too much evidence at all for this one, and Jason's whereabouts are still unknown, and he is still to this day considered a missing person. Nicole Moran was an 8-year-old girl who went missing in 1985 in Toronto, Canada. She was at the time living here with her mum on the 20th floor of this apartment complex, and at around 11 a.m. on this fine summer's day, she had planned to go swimming with one of her friends, and this friend was also living in the same building. The pool that they had planned to go swimming at was a pool at the back of the complex, so they didn't really have to leave the property to go and access it. So Nicole got ready, she left her home, and she was all, kitted out for swimming. She was in a swimsuit, she had a towel, she had goggles. But 5 minutes later, Nicole's friend buzzed up to Nicole's mum's apartment and said basically, "I'm here, where's Nicole? She hasn't come to meet me yet." And Nicole's mum basically said, she's probably gone to the pool herself, or she's out back playing with the other kids, and was like, go and see where she is, sort of thing. Her mum at the time was running a daycare, and so I guess she thought she didn't really have time to be messing around with this, which, it's like finding your own daughter. But I guess in her head, she thought that Nicole was safe somewhere, and so she didn't report Nicole missing for another 4 hours. And of course, when she reported her, she wasn't in the pool, she wasn't in the back of the complex, she wasn't in the lobby, she wasn't anywhere. And so obviously the police were called, the area was cordoned off, searches were started, investigations were started, and it ended up becoming one of the biggest missing person searches in Toronto history. They set up roadblocks all over the areas and stopped cars and traffic. They knocked on and searched every single door and apartment in the building, and they poured tens of thousands of man-hours into this investigation and spent millions of dollars on it in just the first year alone. There was a reward set up for $100,000 to anyone with any information leading to Nicole's safe return. Her dad quit his job, and he and Nicole's mum ended up moving back in together and basically dedicating their entire lives to finding Nicole, which is absolutely understandable. But despite years of investigations and private investigators and clues and interviews, no headway has ever really been made in this case. The security cameras show that Nicole went down an elevator down into the lobby, and then just nothing. No physical evidence was ever collected in regards to Nicole's disappearance, except for a very strange note that was found in Nicole's apartment, on which Nicole had handwritten months earlier, "I'm going to disappear," which is awfully strange, and they never really came to a conclusive answer for this clue. No DNA evidence was ever found, no real suspects were ever developed, and this case, while currently still open, is considered a cold case, and Nicole, almost 40 years later, is still considered a missing person. And that is all we have time for. I really hope you enjoyed exploring this 6th tier of the Unsolved Mystery Iceberg with me. It's honestly probably one of my favorite tiers so far, and it was a long time coming. Feel free to check out each new episode as they're released, and if you'd like to watch every mystery I have done in this iceberg so far, there is a link down in the description below to the full playlist. And as always, thanks for watching.